Please welcome AtlanticLIVE President Margaret Lowe.
Thank you, thank you. Good morning, Houston. It is hot enough here. I am Margaret Lowe, as our voice of God just told you, and I'm president of AtlanticLIVE, which is the events division of the Atlantic magazine, and I'm so happy to see all of you here and to welcome you to Race and Justice Houston. By way of explanation, our gathering here today is part of a multi-year exploration of race and criminal justice in cities across the country. We actually launched this series 3 years ago in Washington, D.C., to explore the issues that Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote about in a cover story for the magazine, The Black Family in the Age of Mass Incarceration. And after we were in Washington, the next year we traveled to Los Angeles to explore justice, access, and equity in the country's demographic bellwether. Last fall, we were in Charlotte, North Carolina. After that, in Tucson. So why, you might ask, did we choose to come to Houston? I think probably everybody in this room knows that Houston is one of the largest and most racially diverse cities in the country. Houstonians, and this is something that I just learned and was pretty awed by, Houstonians speak 145 different languages and can trace their roots across the globe. The city's economy is booming, and so is the population, and yet, not surprisingly, as in so many cities across the country, not everyone is experiencing the benefits of Houston's economic success. The number of people living in poverty here continues to rise, and as you all know too well, Hurricane Harvey compounded the challenges in profound ways. Houston is still contending with post-disaster conditions. The storm left a third of the city underwater, displaced tens of thousands of people who couldn't stay in their homes, and 9 months later, everyone is still working to get back to normal, whatever normal really is. And the criminal justice system is no exception. Judges are handling cases in temporary courtrooms. District attorneys are working out of 11 different county buildings. The county jail lost beds in the storm and is now at capacity. Beyond the storm, there are some other stark realities. In 2016, nearly half of the people in the Harris County Jail were African American. That number ebbs and flows, but it's worth noting that African Americans make up less than 1/5 of the population in this county. And nearly 1 in 3 people in jail here have some kind of mental illness. Today, we're going to explore the road ahead for the criminal justice system and the many related issues here in Houston and in the wider county. Before we roll, I want to take a minute to thank the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation's Safety and Justice Challenge. This gathering would not be possible without the Foundation's support of our journalism, and I am delighted to introduce the program's director. She is Lori Garducki, and she is here to say a few words. Lori.
Good morning, Houston, and congratulations on your victory last night by the Rockets. So there was some confusion for some of us of the Rockets and the Astros, but arguably you already have one world championship. So, as Margaret said, I'm Lori Garducki. I direct the criminal justice program at the MacArthur Foundation. We've been supporting the Atlantic for these events as part of our Safety and Justice Challenge, the Foundation's initiative to change the way America thinks about and uses jails. Now, we have a long track record in working on justice issues at the Foundation. We supported juvenile justice reform, including some work even here in Texas for over a decade, where we wanted to bring a more developmental approach to holding young people accountable when they're in conflict with the law. We watched as the state of Texas reduced the incarceration rate of young people. As that work continued across the country, I'm very pleased to say that incarceration right now for young people in the United States is at its lowest in over 40 years. Incarceration rates have dropped by nearly 60%. So when we began thinking about how we might expand and build on the work we were doing, we turned our attention at the very front end of the system and the overuse and misuse of jails. So last February in 2015, the MacArthur Foundation launched the Safety and Justice Challenge, which is over $100 million initiative to change the way jails are used in this country. Why jails, not prisons? Why not the back end of the system and sentencing reform? Well, the number of people who are admitted to jail annually, nearly 11 million admissions, is 20 times the number of people who go to jail. And jails are, frankly, one of the greatest drivers of over-incarceration in the United States. And moreover, it's also where most people experience the criminal justice system. Now, who are the people who are in our jails? Well, as 2/3 of them are being held pre-trial, so they're innocent unless they're proven to be guilty. Many people are there because they can't make low-money bail or they suffer from serious mental illness. So jails, instead of being places that promote public safety, ensure that people show up to court, have become warehouses for the poor and those whose other systems has failed them. So we're now working with 40 jurisdictions across the country in 25 states, including Harris County, to address the misuse and overuse of jails and to explore alternatives to incarceration. We placed a particular emphasis on dealing with racial and ethnic disparities. Our goal is to build fair, more effective, and equitable local justice systems that use data-driven, innovative, and collaborative ways of working together to put evidence-based practice in place. Now, as I said, Harris County was one of nearly 200 jurisdictions that were selected for this deep investment. We gave Harris County a target of reducing its jail population by 21% in 3 years. In the last several years, Harris County was making progress towards reaching that goal, but as we've always heard, as we have heard, Harvey has had devastating effects on its capacity to meet its goals, so that now the jail is nearly at its capacity. On the other hand, there's no quick fix, and the progress that had occurred before Harvey is something that the county can continue to build on. There's now data in hand to help identify places in the system, how cases are processed that need to be changed, whether that's the number of admissions, how long people are staying in jail, the conditions under which they're released. We're looking at pretrial services, probation, and case processing. We're also emphasizing the importance of meaningful engagement, borrowing a line from the disability community, no change about us without us. So while there has been a setback in Harris County, I think that it is making progress, and we're here to understand the challenges that remain. So I'm pleased that we have such a good crowd to what I hope will be a set of provocative discussions about the course forward. We know that Harris County is dedicated and committed and passionate about what's happening in the city, the demographic changes. But what I want to emphasize in thinking about criminal justice reform or race and justice, we're talking about economic justice, social justice, as well as racial justice. So thank you for having us here today. Thank you to the Atlantic for hosting this event, and let's get on with the program. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lori. I do have a few less lofty, more practical notes for everybody. This is sort of complete command of the obvious in this day and age, but please silence your cell phones. But do keep them close because we're on Twitter at AtlanticLIVE, and we'd love you to join the conversation there. The hashtag is RaceJusticeTX. There are no spaces, RaceJusticeTX. We want you to be part of the conversation in the room, too, so we're going to have an opportunity for you to ask questions of our speakers after each session. And with that, let's get rolling. We're going to begin with for a public safety perspective with Harris County Sheriff Ed Gonzalez. Sheriff Gonzalez is a native Houstonian, has been serving this area for a long time. He was a police officer, a member of the City Council, and Mayor Pro Tem. And he is here with my colleague, Atlantic Senior Editor Jillian White. Mayor Gonzalez, Jillian, welcome.
Sheriff, so when you were elected on a platform of reform. I'm wondering, we heard a little bit about some of the challenges that were facing Houston, but can you talk about what you saw specifically that made you want to be an agent for change?
Well, in my through my perspective that I'd gained through my experience with the Houston Police Department and later through Houston City Council, the driving question for me was I could see us incarcerating people, but I wasn't seeing the intervention and prevention up front. Mm-hmm. And to me, when I looked across the national landscape and saw that we were spending about $80 billion a year incarcerating people, and yet we still had crime, and that only included it didn't include the whole cost of the criminal justice system, just the incarceration piece. To me, I felt that we could develop a more effective criminal justice system that could be more fair to everybody and be more cost effective as well. So I thought that we need to look at our jail population and really rethink jails.
And how do you think you've done thus far on that?
I think that we made significant progress. I think that last year obviously was kind of an outlier when you consider Harvey, and we lost pretty much the tail end of the year last year, but I thought we were making great strides. I think we have a unique situation here in Harris County where you have a lot of collaboration taking place. When you lay it over with the MacArthur Foundation and us being a safety and justice grantee, I think that's important. And then great relationships here between area law enforcement, with HPD, with the district attorney's office. All of us working together, we were able to create, for example, a diversion program for marijuana, for smaller amounts of marijuana, that we were starting to see the fruits of that. We were starting to we developed an entire unit focused on mental health and also diversion, working closely with Director Herring that's here. We also partnered with My Brother's Keeper, so we could take a forward-thinking look at our jail population. Through My Brother's Keeper, what we're doing is we're looking at our jail population, trying to identify individuals that have children in the feeder patterns that they operate under, and then we're trying to proactively engage with those children ahead of time, because we know that if there's no intervention, the stigma of arrest on the family will lead to higher incarceration rates down the road. So we're thinking a much proactive look. In my mind, my role as sheriff extends much further than just the proverbial four walls of a jail cell, but it also extends in how can we build up communities. Because I think that law enforcement these days is being tasked with being on the front lines of three very important issues: addiction, mental illness, and poverty. And to me, law enforcement can have a role. We could have some leadership, engagement on that. But beyond that, we really need community-based responses to that. And so we need to rethink how we use jails and divert to other community-based approaches that could help address some of these systemic issues.
I want to stick on that last point of jails and poverty for a second. In Harris County, there's a lawsuit related to cash bail in which I believe you were named, but you also wrote a brief in support of it. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that topic and also why you would choose to write that brief.
When I was about to take office, I made the decision to request that the sheriff's office be kept in the lawsuit, because there was a movement going on to remove the sheriff's office from that lawsuit, and I wanted to make sure that the sheriff's office, i.e. me, would be at the table, hopefully to develop some type of reform. I didn't know what the reform would look like in the end, but I just felt that we could rethink how we kept people in jail here. Sometimes a large percentage of our jail population are pretrial detainees. They've yet to be convicted of anything. They're simply waiting to get their case disposition or their adjudication. And so to me, I thought that we could have a more robust conversation. And I do want to add that prior to me ever coming, the Harris County government had been doing a lot of very forward, proactive steps, really started under Commissioner Earl Franco Lee, back when he was with us. And, I think there were a lot of investments, significant investments that have been done here in Harris County. What my contention was is that we could operate much faster, and time was of the essence. And every day that somebody's in jail is it's really impacting the family. It's really impacting our communities at large. And me coming from, again, a city council perspective as well, I know that active communities are safe communities, and so this is a workforce issue. It's a social justice issue, and we just needed to do better. We needed to better employ other resources, like maybe putting ankle monitors, maybe drug testing, other options other than just cash bail. Because if you have somebody that commits a violent crime and they're able to bond out, they get out. It doesn't matter how violent or what the threat is. If they get a bond and they have the money to pay it, they get out. You take a poor person that may commit, let's say, a nonviolent offense, but they can't pay it, they stay in jail. And to me, that's not equitable, that's not right, and I thought it needs to change, or I think it needs to change.
And I'm wondering, how quickly do you think, well, one, do you think those reforms will be put in place? And two, if so, how quickly?
Well, I'm encouraged by some of the court rulings that we've seen. Obviously that's still in the works, so I'm still technically involved with it, so there's not a whole lot I could talk about the court case itself, but I think it'll get resolved. I think that history will be on our side in regards to reform taking place. And I think that we're heading in the right direction, and it's about finding the right system that works. I think it should be risk-based, because, look, at the end of the day, for me, I do look at everything through the lens of what will keep the community safe. And if I felt that somebody in jail that doesn't need to be, needs to be in there, then maybe perhaps we could make the argument for keeping people safer. But there's a lot of people that frankly don't believe in jail. They need drug treatment. They need other interventions. We could be creative. We need to have every tool in our toolbox, and one size does not fit all. And so I think we have to be more creative. We're in the 21st century now. What got us here isn't going to get us where we need to go as a country, in my opinion. And so I think we have to be more creative, smarter, better use of technology, to really emphasize who needs to be in jail and who doesn't.
So on that point, I want to talk a little bit about the shooting of Danny Ray Thomas. And you dismissed the officer who shot him. I think for anyone who is watching national news coverage right now of policing, there hasn't, or it has seemed like there hasn't been a ton of punishment of officers who have shot people who are potentially mentally ill. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your decision-making process when it came to that specific issue.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, at this point, there's a lawsuit pending on that, so I'm really limited on what I could say. I think, my actions, I think, have been clear. I think, the public statements that we made on it. I will say that, as I mentioned, law enforcement is being tasked with being at the front lines of dealing with these issues such as mental illness, and other poverty and other things that, frankly, in my mind, should be helped much prior, so that law enforcement isn't always at the front lines. It should be looked as a public health issue, similar to addiction, and we should look at it through that lens, not a criminal justice issue. And we've gone to great strides to really improve our training. We really emphasized de-escalation. We also want to continue to emphasize, we have a pilot program that's really innovative, maybe the first of its kind in the country. When we engage with somebody that has a potential mental illness, we could get on a laptop, an iPad out on the field, connect with a psychiatrist 24/7 so that they could better diagnose what's going on with that individual. Hopefully we could triage it better, hopefully divert them from the criminal justice system. And we could get them the help they need, and at the same time make sure both parties stay safe. And so it's unfortunate. Again, we're sorry for the loss of Mr. Thomas, and we'll always, as an agency, strive to do better and learn from every situation that happens here and abroad. We hope to have better outcomes in the future.
You've talked a little bit about kind of the myriad things that officers are now being asked to do, assessing mental health and learning how to deal with that, on the front lines is one of them. I'm wondering if you think that you have the resources needed to train officers for all the things that they might encounter and put those tools in their toolbox.
Well, one of the things coming in as sheriff, I've only been there a little bit more than a year, and it really takes a long time. And, we really were hampered through Harvey. If you look at our population, we were steadily decreasing tremendously. We had stopped outsourcing inmates out to other facilities. We're making great progress. And Harvey hits, and you see our population go up. And we're really troubled by that, because what we're seeing now is our population coming in is relatively the same. What's happening is they're not coming out. Because it's stagnant. We're not getting enough trials going, and so by return, our space is getting filled up rather quickly, so we're really in a very difficult position right now with that. With that said, look, we could always use more resources. I don't know of any major agency that will say that they're good with what they have. With that said, we have a very fair budget. We're the highest budget for the entire county. And so we're going to make sure that we use every dollar effectively. I think we have. And when I took over the sheriff's office, we were over budget. My first year in office, we were able to reduce it by several million to come in under budget. And our goal was to redirect that into intervention, prevention, public safety, resources out in the community. Unfortunately, with these costs coming in with the jail, it's being spent on the bureaucracy instead of really going out there and being proactive. And so that's a little bit disappointing for me because we'd rather use those dollars, in my mind, in a more effective way. But the point about it is to assess what we have right now, what our strengths are, what our weaknesses are, where we need better resources, and then to make that ask as well. But I think, look, HPD, I know is shorthanded. I know the fire department could use more resources for the city, similar to us. We could definitely use more. The county has grown tremendously. In Harris County proper, we have more population than the entire state of Louisiana. That's amazing. It's a huge area. I'm responsible for over 1,700 square miles, working with more than 25 different municipalities. So it's a big task. So we could always use more resources. But we have to also be smart and not make excuses and work with what we have.
I want to let the audience know that I will be coming to you in about 2 or 3 minutes for questions. So if you can start thinking about them now, condensing them on down. We'll have mic runners at the corner. So if you could just raise your hands up high when we come to the question section. So I want to talk a little bit about violent crime, which has been on the rise in Harris County. I'm wondering if you have a theory on what is causing that and what the department is doing to address it.
Yeah, well, many times it's cyclical. They go up and down. One of the troubling things for me is that with some of these robbery crews, we're seeing that they're becoming younger and younger, as young as 13 and 14 years old, that are getting involved in this violent criminal behavior. And so that's difficult when we're seeing this happening in our communities. One of the strategies that we're doing is we're looking at our resources and trying to redeploy, do more of a decentralization model where we could assess what the crime is, put more resources out in the community, not only in the law enforcement side, but also in the investigative side, also in the prevention side with our community engagement division, for example. So it's a multi-pronged approach that we hope to use, and then seeing what's working, measure it in real time, and then continue to make adjustments. And when we talk about reform and our jail population, there's a misnomer sometimes that that's being soft on crime somehow. But I think to the contrary, for us, we're being more effective in crime fighting because I'd rather use those resources really going after the violent criminals that are impacting all our communities, that we all want to be protected from, rather than the lower level offenders, that college student that has some kind of drug addiction that really maybe shouldn't be incarcerated. Maybe we should find a diversion program that works, preferably before they pre-booking, before they even hit the jailhouse. The more people we could take out of our criminal justice system, to me, the better it is for everybody. Yeah.
So you're still in the kind of early days of being sheriff. I'm wondering, as you look ahead, as you think of what you want to accomplish in this role, what are the main things that you're seeking to do? What would you want to be said about your tenure of sheriff when you're done?
Well, I'd like to, for me, I'm very committed and passionate about my work. I've been a lifelong public servant, and for me, probably, the genesis of my passion for this work started when I was about 6 years old, when I learned that my father couldn't read and write, and seeing how it impacted his life and our family. And I often say that if you look at the statistics, I would be more likely to be incarcerated in our county jail than ever be Harris County Sheriff. But here I am through the grace of God and through their upbringing. And so, I want to make sure that we create an effective criminal justice system that's fair for everyone, because it's the bedrock of our society. But it has to work for both sides, because we never know what one day that one of our loved ones will be caught on the other side. And we want a fair system that works for those that are accused just as much as it works for the victims. And I think that there's a lot of right sizing that needs to be done in that. I think that we can't incarcerate our way out of these problems. So I hope that, we could see a really proactive policing agency that works as hard to prevent and intervene with criminality that it does to incarcerate people. And I think that very fortunate, and I think we have a great agency. It's the third largest in the country, largest in Texas, and I think by and large, we work hard every day, and we have great men and women that could get the job done. It's just a matter of all working together to accomplish our goals and to create just a more effective system, as well as keeping our residents safe, because at the end of the day, for me, that's the number one thing, is we have to keep our residents safe.
All right, we want to make sure our audience is part of the conversation as well. So if you have questions, if you could get those hands up. Oh, one right here, and then one right there. Oh, sorry.
I'm Holly Headley, and I'm from Houston. I'm wondering if, as you're trying to lessen the populations in the criminal justice system, are beds being increased, for example, in the Harris County Health system for psychiatric uses or psychological uses for mental health? Thank you.
I'm very happy that right now we're working on a triage facility that we hope becomes a reality. When I was on city council, I helped create the Houston Sobering Center, the Houston Recovery Center, where we diverted on average about 15,000 people that would have otherwise been arrested for public intoxication, whether it be a homeless vet, a student, a business person, whoever. We used to incarcerate that population. Now we divert them. And it's a non-criminal tool, and it's been very effective. And so we're hoping to create a similar triage for maybe individuals with minor offenses that are exhibiting some kind of mental illness. So again, they never hit the county jail. They go into this facility. They could be stabilized a little bit, get them the resources that they need, and then we could move them on. We also have a very strong reentry program under the leadership of Director Herring that's very successful within our jail, where we really try to empower those that are incarcerated to leave with better tools and skill set than when they enter the jail cell, so that hopefully we could stop recidivism. And so, we're hoping to also create more beds in the mental health space, but that's kind of outside of our league. We're just one cog of a larger system. The state of Texas traditionally has been very woefully underfunding these areas, and so that's something we need to advocate our state. I know Judge Emmett has been a champion on these issues and has worked very hard, and I think there's some progress being done. I know he's actively working on this triage facility. So I think we could get to a better place, but I think, MPC, our neuropsychiatric center, usually has about 250 beds. It was intended to have 500, so we're woefully unequipped to deal with the mental issues that we're dealing and seeing more of in our community. There's a growing issue. We're seeing an aging population that's impacted with dementia and Alzheimer's, for example, and so we need to invest more in that. That goes back to what I said about intervention and prevention, not incarceration, because right now, we use our jails sometimes to incarcerate people with dementia because they get picked up for trespassing, for example, and no one's paying attention to the underlying issue. And they need a personal care home, not a county jail bed. Yeah.
And I think we had another question right here.
Yes. My name is Alain Cisneros, and I'm with Fiel Houston. My question is, if the sheriff office comply with the SB4, and the sheriff office has the secure communities inside the Harris County jails, why we need a physical ICE office inside the building of the Harris County sheriff? What do we need?
Yeah, they were there when I arrived. I ended the 287G program that I had committed to do, which is putting our local resources to do the job of ICE. I felt that with so many other priorities, and it was a voluntary program, that we can get away from that. But especially with SB4 now, we're mandated to comply. So I can't have an activist perspective on the issue. I have to comply with the law. That's my job. And I'm tasked by SB4, and I advocated against SB4. I don't think it's needed. I think it's unfair, and I think it's a bad law. But at the same time, I have to comply with the law. One of the things that we've seen, we haven't seen in Harris County, what we've seen in other jurisdictions, which is where ICE is doing big roundups at apartment complexes and different localities out in the community. And one thing is because we have a jail pay system here in Harris County, whether we agree with that or not, it's handled inside the jail when somebody's been picked up on another crime, and they check their databases. And if they determine somebody perhaps that has a previous history with ICE or a previous deportation order, then that's really ICE purview, and we're mandated to comply with them on that. is our understanding, and we wish it wasn't like that, but it is. And so for us, it's picking your poison a little bit. Should we have it inside where they could deal with them in a jail-based setting, or do we have them appearing in our courthouses and outside as soon as a person gets released? Because they have access to the federal database that shows who's in our system, and they can research it and just simply be waiting outside the county jail doors when they exit, as they've done in other jurisdictions. To me, that's not a safe thing for anybody. And so it's not a perfect system. I wish it were different, but again, we have to comply with SB4. But I hope that at some point, and I'm discouraged, unfortunately, with the current state of affairs, that we would have comprehensive immigration reform and have a more thoughtful discussion on immigration, because we have a false narrative that's out there. Instead of talking about real immigration reform, about the need for our workforce, the need, the importance on our economy, dealing with important issues such as, we could talk about securing the border, but we could also talk about energy reforms that were going on in Mexico and how they could impact in a positive way Texas. We should have a North American strategy. We should be working together, working with Canada, Mexico, and the United States, and instead we're talking about more division. And 22 states depend on Mexico as its #1 or #2 trade partner. So all those issues should be talked about in a more sophisticated way than what we're hearing sometimes from some of our elected officials.
Everyone, please join me in thanking the Sheriff for his time.
For a look at justice in Harris County, please welcome Kim Ogg, the District Attorney of Harris County, Loretta Ray, a case manager and supervisor at the Salvation Army of Houston, Alex Bunnan, the Chief Public Defender of Harris County, Teresa May, the Director of Harris County Community Supervision and Corrections Department, and Judge Brock Thomas, who oversees Harris County's Responsive Interventions for Change docket. Here to lead the conversation, welcome Atlantic Senior Editor Ron Brownstein.
Good morning, everybody, and good morning, panelists. We're going to talk about a lot of specifics in the next half hour, policies on diversion, on criminal justice reform, on public safety. But I'd like to start by asking all of you a broad question. When you think about the criminal justice system today in Harris County, what do you think is the biggest challenge? What is the biggest problem that reform efforts should be focused on solving? How do you define the goal before we get to the means of achieving the goal? And District Attorney Ogg, maybe you could start us.
Well, public safety is what people expect out of the criminal justice system, but they want it handled fairly. And so I think a big challenge is regaining the public's trust that we live in a free society, we have need for law and order, but we can do it in a way that is applied equally. And I think that's where people see the inequity in the past. So that's a challenge. And then locally, post the biggest national disaster and natural disaster in our country, our local system is particularly challenged because we are still displaced. Our courts, our probation department, our prosecutors, our public defenders, and we're scattered throughout the city, giving us difficult logistics just in terms of getting to court. The public faces the same problems. These are county governance and city governance issues, and they're bigger than any one of us in the system, and yet we're all affected by it. More importantly, the people are affected by it.
Loretta, you've been through the system. What do you see as the biggest challenge?
The biggest challenge, I would have to agree with District Attorney Ogg that, the bus being in the post-Harvey with the crisis that's going on, a lot of disparities between individuals who are less fortunate, homeless individuals, especially with me being on the ground level of engaging these individuals. The displacement of people, like I mentioned yesterday, going to court systems with clients and trying to support them and them not knowing where they're going, that's a major concern as well. I also think that the lack of a trauma-informed approach is a big issue as well, as to people entering into the criminal system and just continuing to cycle through.
Define trauma-informed approach. What do you mean?
So the trauma-informed approach is just realizing that the people that we're 30, 40 years old now, cycling through homelessness and criminal justice systems, but we were once children who may have experienced some form of trauma, and it affects our coping skills and committing minor offenses, drug offenses, things like that, and not having the resources available to address those issues, mental health issues, substance abuse issues.
Well, I begin with the premise that the criminal justice system is a repository for all society's problems. This is where they go. So addiction, mental health, race, and poverty are all problems that we deal with in the criminal justice system, but they're not problems we deal with well, because criminal justice is the most expensive and inefficient way to deal with those issues. So I think what we need to keep in mind is that we should do the least harm, and do that by only prosecuting when we really need to, not burdening people with fines and fees, making sure that we can get people's records cleared up so that it doesn't follow them for the rest of their lives. So again, do the least harm is what I think is my biggest issue.
We'll come back to that and this question of whether the problems within the system, whether the problems of the criminal justice system can be solved primarily within the system or from changes outside. But Dr. May?
I would say overwhelmingly the biggest challenge is a lack of resources. We have many people who need services, treatment. The criminal justice system at this point in community supervision, we do treatment and work with individuals to try to help them get their lives on track. And there are many systems in our community that are underfunded as well. The mental health system, education, those kinds of things that have already been a failure in their lives. So the needs are great. And a recognition that the needs are very complex. So the example of trauma-informed treatment, she's exactly right. You know, educating people on what that means. Someone that's been through trauma is going to see the world a little bit different, and educating everyone working with those people how to recognize that is really important. So resources overwhelmingly, and the recognition that it's not simple. It's very complex.
Judge Thomas.
Sure. I mean, I would echo what everybody else on the panel had said. Obviously, those and other issues.
You won't go last always, by the way. I promise.
It's okay. You know, I think one of our challenges is, obviously, we all recognize, anybody that's been in or around our criminal justice system, that there's obviously need for and a necessity for improvement and to continue at that. Obviously, there can be differences of opinion on how far, how broad, how deep. But I think one of our challenges is taking that recognition that there needs to be improvement, and how do we translate that into tangible things that actually move the ball forward. We spend a lot of time, unfortunately, many times talking about the things that we may disagree on, but there are a number of things that we do agree on. How do we then focus in on those things? And I think, for example, some of the work through the Coordinating Council for Harris County Government and all of the stakeholders, through the Safety Justice Challenge and through MacArthur, we've seen some examples of that, where it's not the be-all, end-all, and it's not perfect, but how can we, again, move from recognition of those challenges and those shortcomings and find tangible things that we can do to make a difference with that? And I think we'll speak further about that.
Let me follow up on that, because if you look at the data, the incarceration rate in the Harris County Jail is well below the peak in the 90s and well below where it was even in 2010, but it's still relatively at the higher end of the range of the past 40 years. And as part of that grant that you cited, you've committed to reducing that by about 20% in the next 3 years. As you look at that goal, which is a substantial goal, what are your greatest points of leverage? Where do you think you can make the most difference in reducing the incarceration rate without, as the DA started, threatening public safety? Yeah.
Well, I think there's a number of different ways, and again, there's not one be-all, end-all to that. I think, for example, the responsive interventions for change, or formerly our reintegration court, that's a name. I mean, we're an example of that, where we recognize and understand that we have a number of people. Since inception of October of 16, almost 8,000 cases for less than a gram felony amount drug cases. And when you add in the 1 to 4 grams that we've recently taken on. But we've all recognized that with that population, we can do better. We can look to see more of those folks. How can we get people in jail to begin with?
Explain how the experience of an offender in that court would differ from what they would have faced before.
Typically before, somebody charged with one of those offenses would go to one of 22 district courts, and there are obviously all kinds of different things that could happen with that. Being mindful that those cases would be handled and on dockets that are intermingled with your rapes, murders, robberies, and everything else in between. Now, as opposed to those being spread out, they come through a centralized docket where we deal with those exclusively those issues. Try to get more people out to begin with, because we obviously know, and the goal is obviously to reduce the jail population, reduce the number of people go there, how long they stay there, and obviously reduce the numbers that come back. Try to get people out, try to get people as appropriate connected with appropriate therapeutic programming, whether it's drug treatment, whether it's getting connected to mental health services when they've never been connected or reconnected. A whole bunch of other things that go along with that, housing and all the other things, and I could go on and on with that. But to try to take, a proper assessed approach, get people evaluated for what they need, and get people connected with those things. Obviously, some of those cases, people are charged and they need a trial or a motion to suppress. Those cases then get sent back out to the district courts to handle that. But we've disposed of the 8,000 or so, 5,000 or so at our court. And a lot of those have been dismissed, and that was the appropriate resolution. If that's the just result, getting that quicker is better for everyone. But historically, before those cases, many of them did result in being in jail at the time of their disposition, taking small amounts of jail time, and coming back over and over again. And we have flipped that. More people out, vast majority of people getting placed in either pretrial interventions where their case can be dismissed and ultimately expunged, or deferred adjudications for people that historically would not have got it. Second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth offenders where it just didn't work before. They need treatment. We need to get people connected with the appropriate resources. And so, again, it's a work in progress. Are the appropriate
resources there?
We need more, no doubt.
Yeah. Loretta, you're nodding when I was asking about whether the appropriate resources are there if you divert.
Yeah, the resources are scarce. The resources are not there. I think back in the early and late 90s where individuals would be arrested for having paraphernalia. And in those times, people would get 25-year sentences where they would do a short amount of time because I think it was a month or so per year, but then they would come out without the resources that could help them to sustain and become productive citizens in society, and then they reoffend because they go back to their addictions, and then they're back in the system on a parole violation, and then it's just that repeated cycle.
So let me go back to the question that I asked Judge. Dr. May, what do you see as the most significant points of leverage to reduce the jail population without increasing risk to public safety?
Well, one of the things that we do in the the Resource of Intervention for Change Court is to do a good assessment. It's really important that we meet people where they are. I don't want anyone making assumptions about what someone may need just because of what they were arrested for. So we start with a very extensive assessment for the people that we serve. We want to make sure that we are meeting the needs that are causing the issues. And obviously the resources are critical to that. But the ultimate goal is to give people the skills and the needs that are causing issues, remove those barriers, so that they can live a productive life. They don't come back. And that's, really the end goal. We want to get people what they need and get their lives turned around so they don't continue to cycle in and out. Get them back with families, get them jobs. And ultimately, that is a smart move because, the rearrest rates were 70%.
Yeah.
Before we were doing this with people doing short amounts of time. And the only thing that they were getting was a conviction and no treatment, no services, no change. Our goal is to help people get their lives back on track and get the things that they've missed. So it's a lot to do, but it is working. The rearrest rates are significantly lower under this model.
I'd say two issues. One, avoid arresting people because, for instance, we specialize in representing severely mentally ill people charged with misdemeanors, so trespass, prostitution, petty theft. A lot of those cases wouldn't be filed. They would take them for crisis intervention to the psychiatric center, but sometimes the psychiatric center is full. They can only hold them for a short period of time, so they end up in the criminal justice system. So that's one thing. The other thing is, for all cases, we need more pretrial release. We need more people let out waiting for their case to be resolved. I was a federal public defender for 20 years. In the federal system, money bail is the last resort. In our system, traditionally, it's been the first resort, and it's kept a lot of people in custody.
Yeah, like in most places, what, you're at 3/4 of your jail population is in a pretrial, or roughly what percentage? And that obviously raises the question of the bail system, on which you have been engaged in extensive and ongoing litigation. Where do things stand now? What are the prospects for a settlement that reforms the bail system in Harris County?
Well, our county government has spent $8 million or close to it defending an archaic, wealth-based bail system. I think that's wrong. We do need a risk-based system that allows us to present evidence of people's danger to the community so that a judge can make a factual decision about whether or not to release that person. But our system isn't set up to do that. So we've had this lawsuit, but the actual answers, I think, will be determined once when the lawsuit is finalized, but second by our legislature. And remember, this is the same legislature elected by the people that has not adequately funded our mental health system, our education system. And so I think we need to look at broad changes in the law to ultimately fix the bail system.
So just to be clear, even if the lawsuit is settled, you don't think that is the ultimate, so that will not take you all of the way toward the solutions that you believe are necessary?
It won't, because under the current system, regardless of how dangerous you are, if you have enough money to make the bail, regardless of how high the judge sets it, you get out of jail. Whereas the poorest person, regardless of how low their risk is, if they cannot make the bail, then they cannot get out of jail. The lawsuit only affects misdemeanor cases right now, and those are easier to deal with. And I think that it's the waste of resources at a time when we need them so much that I think is frustrating. But what the public needs to understand is that you're just not, your interests really aren't being protected. Your interest as the public, at least my family's are, is we want to be safe in our homes.
Well, there is, Judge, there's a perspective on the other side. There have been those who criticize the idea of reforming bail practices on the notion that this is going to lead to more people on the street who might commit other crimes. Are they right to be concerned that reforming the system could produce more threats to public safety, or are reform and safety compatible by allowing more focus and concentration on the most dangerous? Judge, let me ask you. Your thought.
Look, I think as it is with our criminal justice system as a whole, pretrial justice being a part of that, there's certainly room for improvement at that, no question. You know, there are things that were in process that have been in place with regard to use of the Arnold tool, for example, on our pretrial assessments that are being utilized and were in the works at or near the time of the lawsuit. I'm not familiar exactly with all of the timing of it. Look, I don't know how the lawsuit shakes out at the end of the day. I think we will have moved forward wherever it shakes out. I think even that being the case, there will still, and I agree that there will still be work to be done. That the end of the lawsuit is not going to end that issue, that there will still need to be things that are worked programmatically, systematically, and even legislatively. Obviously, when you talk about one aspect of it, as the district attorney had mentioned with regard to preventative detention, if you will, for certain cases, we're very limited by Constitution and statute in terms of the type of narrow circumstances where somebody can be held without bail. But Obviously, this is a tough issue and a lot of strong opinions about it. Understand that. I don't pretend to speak for any and all judges. On a good day, I can speak for myself, so I won't try to speak for all the others. But we all recognize that clearly there's room for improvement on that. There can be differences of opinion on scope, but whatever happens with the lawsuit, there will still be work that needs to be done on that. That I am
Alex, from your vantage point, how far can the lawsuit get toward resolving the issues in the bail system?
Only so far. I mean, it has to be a cultural change. It has to be, everyone buys into the fact that there is some risk in releasing people. But especially when you're talking about misdemeanor persons, the risk is typically not that they're going to commit a murder. The risk is that, well, they might not show up in court or they might commit another trespass. So you really have to look at it objectively and understand that we are paying a lot of money and keeping a lot of people in jail over issues that I don't believe are necessarily public safety the way the public thinks about public safety. They don't want to be robbed, they don't want to be burglarized, but we keep a lot of people in jail just under the premise that maybe, even if they're not particularly risky themselves, maybe that increases the harm to public safety.
Well, and this goes to the broader question, not solely about bail, but about the whole thrust of reform. There are those like the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, in speeches who have basically argued that reform and safety are inimical, that basically you increase the risk by demanding more accountability from police or different practices in the criminal justice system. What is your response to that? What is there? Does reform come at the cost of public safety, or can the two be synergistic?
I am confident that not only is reform compatible with public safety, reform is required to make us safer. We have to work out these problems on bail, the problems with what we do with our mentally ill other than jail them, how we handle drug offenders. Are we going to warehouse them, or are we going to treat them, or even move that eventually out of the criminal justice system so that we can focus on the crimes that people care about, that Alex mentioned: burglary, robbery, rape, murder. So I have 31 years experience as a lawyer in Harris County, and it is my absolute belief that the data, the evidence that our administration is producing in terms of focusing on violent crimes and property crimes, not on drug crimes, and trying to move the mentally ill and drug offenders through and out, or even stop them from coming in the system, will make us safer. When we keep people in the workforce, and when we stop disqualifying from the workforce, and we allow people and encourage them and give them the resources to be employed, we are a safer society.
But let me ask you this. I mean, like many cities, the violent crime rate in Houston is much lower than it was in the 90s or even the early 2000s. But it has ticked back up, as in many cities, from 2013 through 2016 at least, which are the statistics that I think the most recent data that's available. Is that a blip? Is there something happening? What is your sense? I mean, is there a reason for people to be concerned about the trend lines, at least? Understanding that at an absolute level, we're much lower than we were 2 decades ago. Many cities have seen an increase in the last several years. Dr. May, any thoughts on that?
Well, one thing to keep in mind, I mean, Harris County and the city have been growing. So depending on how they're looking at the rates and how people are coming in, you know, there need to be adjustments. But, you know, I think you're always going to see trends. We've seen that off and on for quite some time. But again, we have major system failures even before people get to the criminal justice system. So by the time we get to that point, we're going uphill, trying to get people what they need to turn their lives around. The preventative detention is an issue. You know, the very fact that courts see individuals who we know are dangerous and they have to set a bond, even a high bond, and we see people make it, that's a challenge. That does need to be addressed. We need to be able to have the time to make sure that we know who we are dealing with. The PSA has come a long way in providing a tool to help us with many things. There's a violence flag. But at the same time, it's a balance of safety and justice. And again, we have to have the resources to help people get where they need to go. And we have to work together as a community and as a system.
Judge?
I mean, obviously, when it comes to crime rates and all that, a lot of that's dependent on perspective. If you're a victim of it, then it's high.
Yes.
If you haven't, may view that a little differently. But getting back to what the district attorney said, I agree that I don't, the argument that it has to be one or the other, reform or safety at the expense of the other, I don't think in a lot of circumstances has to be that way. And I think, for example, the collaboration that's gone into how we're dealing with these lower level drug offenses at a felony level is an example of that. There's not much daylight between any of us in terms of difference of opinion of how to address that, and there's been complete buy-in by the district attorney. We've even expanded it from dealing from less than a gram cases to 1 to 4 gram cases now. We all understand and recognize if we do better with those cases, that's better for those individuals, that's better for a system, and it also frees up time and resource to be able to deal with the trials and the handling and the disposition of those violent cases.
Loretta, let me bring you in before we turn to the audience, because the paradox is that many of the same, often it's the same communities that feel most at risk from over-incarceration or the way police are treating individuals, and yet also face the greatest risk statistically of crime. How do you balance in your mind? Is there a cost to safety and reform, or does reform create safer communities?
I believe that reform will balance out the safety concern in the city, but it's all back to the resources again, because an individual can continue to go in and out of the criminal justice system, but if there's no resources available for them when they come out, then they are in survival mode. And so a lot of times they do things to survive, and then they reoffend. And so, in speaking to the fact of, as we spoke last night at the round table, individuals who get criminal backgrounds, they're screwed for housing and employment opportunities. So then what choices do they have at that point?
I think all of you have made the point, and we'll bring in the audience, that there are limits to how much changes inside the criminal justice system itself can solve the problems that are apparent in the criminal. And in many ways, it requires changes outside in terms of education and economic opportunity and social services. Alex, is that where you started that way?
Housing,
downstream.
Yeah, housing, healthcare, all these things that people are not getting outside of the criminal justice system often cause them to come into the criminal justice system, and we do a very poor job of serving them in those needs. So the better we can do on the front end, it's hard when you're dealing with governments that have to spend money and they think of short term, what is this going to cost? A lot of these things are long-term costs, but you end up saving money because you have less people in jail, you have more people without chronic health needs, and you solve those problems, but you have to look in the long run.
Let's bring in the audience. I think, do we have some microphones, questions? Oh, over there.
Hello, my name is Seconda Joseph with BLMHTX, Imagine War. And as you were talking about the question of reform and safety, the first thing that came to my mind, the public was, who is the public that you're speaking about and who is safe? Because one of the things that we're not talking about is we're not saying that the public, the specific people we're talking about are black people and our brown people who are already not safe. My brothers, my nephews, my cousins, my family, we're not safe in our communities. And in addition to that, my question is, we do acknowledge there are a lot of problems with systems everywhere, but where can we start? And I would even suggest with the criminal justice system, one of the areas that we can kind of start at the heart is the way that folks or interact with police from the beginning, because white children that I went to school with who had drug problems and who had trauma are not experiencing this. And if we're going to talk about race and justice, we have to talk about race.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think there's any question that there's been a disparity in the way laws have been enforced, especially when it comes to the drug laws. Anybody who's read Michelle Alexander's book about the new Jim Crow and the way that drug laws came about and the enforcement as it was pushed from the federal government, from President Nixon down, I mean, I think we've seen a lot of disparity. Not only have we damaged the communities where laws have been enforced unequally, but I think we've damaged their economic opportunity. When we over-police drug crimes in the 3rd Ward and not in River Oaks, we lower the property values in those areas by calling them high crime. And so how we're safe in many ways depends on how we count crime. If you count number of arrests as making you safer, well then the areas where we make the most arrests should be the safest, but they're often not. And so it's going to take a shift in the way the population looks at how you're safe. As long as we agree it's not quantity, it's quality. That no neighborhood wants rapists, that no neighborhood wants burglars to go unapprehended. I think until we do that, we're going to have disparity. Our diversion program, I made our marijuana program apply to all who possessed it regardless of criminal background for that reason, because there have been more minority young people arrested and convicted in drug crimes than non-minority members. And so it just seemed the only way we could bring equality to diversion was to make it apply to everybody regardless of their past history if all they possessed was a small amount of drugs. And the carrot on the stick for law enforcement is that it will free police officers up on the street to answer calls for service from people in trouble.
Let's get one more from this side. Yes.
Yes. My name is Pastor James Nash. I got a question, Kim, and all the panel here. How much approximately does it cost to incarcerate an individual? What is the cost factor?
The question was, how much does it cost
The cost of incarcerating marijuana offenders in this county was $27 million a year for every year for 10 years up until 2016. That's what we researched. On the 47th day of my administration, we, along with all the police agencies in this town, stopped arresting people for misdemeanor amounts of marijuana. Instead, they're diverted into an education class.
We've got to run off the stage, but can I ask real quick before we go, do you feel that the 2016 election was a lasting turning point toward a different approach in law enforcement in Harris County, or do you feel that the changes that you're making are still contested and subject to possibly being reversed? Alex?
Oh, okay. I'm not elected, but
I know.
I think we're in flux. I think there are going to continue to be changes, but I think the wave is toward reform.
Judge?
You know, that's hard to say. I think no matter what that is, I think clearly the issue of reform and taking a deeper, harder look at everything criminal justice and what we could do to improve it, that's in front of us, and that's going to be an issue going forward.
Dr. May?
Yeah, I've consistently, for the people that I work with every day on the coordinating council, from the district attorney to the sheriff, judges, commissioners, the public defender, we all want change. Everyone wants to do it better. I don't see reform going backwards. I think we're going to continue to move forward.
Loretta, and then the DA last, maybe?
Well, I'm not elected either, but
right.
I work with the people.
Right. Who do the electing?
I'm out in the trenches working with the people, so I see the effects that happen. So I am hopeful that with this reintegration course and added resources, that there will be a change.
DA.
Well, I think the data is the evidence that we present the public, and you decide every election whether we're governing in the way that you want us to.
All right. Join me in thanking this panel. Thank you.
For a conversation on enforcing the law, please welcome Officer Joe Gamaldi, the president of the Houston Police Officers Union, and welcome back the Atlantic's Jillian White.
So, Officer Gamaldi, I want to start out by asking you what it is that you think is the biggest accomplishment that you could make as the head of the union.
So I feel like the biggest accomplishment I can make as the head of the Police Officers Union is just growing our department. I don't try to speak in cliches, but we are confronted right now with the largest manpower crisis basically in the country as far as manpower is concerned for our department. We have 5,100 officers. Just 15 years ago, we had 5,500, and those of you who are from Houston know our city is growing. Our population is growing, our territory is growing, and the surrounding areas are growing. And the fact of the matter is we cannot keep up as a police department. Our response times are through the roof for Code 1 calls or robbery in progress, aggravated assault in progress. We're up over 6.5 minutes. For lower priority calls, if your house is broken into, if your car is broken into, we're pushing well over 30 minutes. And what it really feeds into is trust within the community. It doesn't matter how nice our police officers are if you've waited 4 hours for us to get there. You're going to be upset because this is the worst day of your life. Your house was broken into, you're feeling vulnerable, but because that officer is running all these Code 1 calls and we're short on people, he can't get to your house for 4 hours. And we have some of the most professional police officers in the country. But yet if they show up there and you've waited 4 hours, you're going to be upset. And it's digging a hole underneath us before we're even there to help you with your problem.
So I want to dig in on that question of the relationship with the community a little. I think some would say that, the relationship between police officers and particularly communities of color has not been so great. So I'm wondering how you would address that and how you're thinking about that going forward.
So something we try to do, not just as a department, because they have their own initiatives to connect with the community, we try to do it on our own as a union. We go out to local high schools. I try to meet with as many high school kids as possible, talk about interactions with the police, that it should be based on mutual respect. We should be respecting you. You should be respecting us back, because after all, that's what we all want. We want to be treated the way that we would expect to treat other people. Another thing we do is just community outreach in any opportunity that we have. So any community events I'm invited to, I love to go out, interact with the community, and try to explain that although our guys and gals wear uniforms, they truly are some of the most loving, caring people you've ever met. And if we can get past the uniform part of it and just get to know each other as people, I think everybody else would see that too.
So we've talked earlier today, I talked with the sheriff a little bit about pushes for reforms, specifically reforms to cash bail. I know that you have been in opposition to some of the reforms, including some of the cash bail reforms. I'm wondering where that opposition stems from.
So here's our opposition. We want PR bonds and zero bonds for the folks that are committing minor crimes. The single mother who's driving with a suspended license, I don't think anybody in this room believes she should be getting a $5,000 bond. Of course not. Absolutely not. The minor misdemeanors that go on. What we're talking about is we do not want low bond amounts for repeat violent offenders. The very people that are victimizing our communities should not be getting low bond amounts. Now, I understand we cannot use bond as incarceration. That's a violation of the Constitution. However, the more violent someone is, we have to ensure their appearance in court. I mean, I'm not sure if the audience knows, the average bond amount for someone who commits murder in this county is $50,000. That means they have to spend $5,000 to get out. And we're seeing this same group of people consistently commit violent crimes, they get low bond amounts, and they're back out victimizing the public. And it's not just bonds. We also have a problem with deferred adjudications. Deferred adjudications should be used for first-time offenders. Give them a break. But they shouldn't be given to people who are on their third, fourth, fifth chance. I mean, we have people getting deferred adjudications for violent felonies, and they're going out and they're harming more people in our community. And I understand we have to be a part of the discussion on criminal justice reform, on bail reform, but somebody also needs to think about the victims in these cases, because I'm getting calls unsolicited calls from the community saying, thank you for bringing light to some of these issues, because somebody who got a low bond amount got out on a gun charge, by the way, which with today in America, with everything that is going on with guns, I can't imagine why we would be supportive of low bond amounts for anybody with a gun, or why would we be in support of deferred adjudication or minor sentencing for gun crimes. I mean, people, this is the scourge of our society right now is gun crimes, but yet we're being soft on them in Harris County. That's not acceptable to us, it's not acceptable to the police officers, and it shouldn't be acceptable to the community. Sorry, go ahead.
No.
Yeah.
So as we go down that line of thinking, and I think this was brought up before, but let's use the example of murder. I want to know how you would think about addressing the economic discrepancy there. Because, in the instance that, somebody commits murder or is accused of a murder, they're considered a violent offender and they're being held, and the idea is, give them bail so that they will, end up in jail being held so they cannot go out and harm the community. That obviously only keeps in jail the people who can't afford to bail out, but if you are a wealthy offender or a wealthy accused offender, then you get to go back out. So how can we address that?
What we're talking about is, it's really, honestly right now, our bail system and our criminal justice system in Harris County is treated like a factory. And we need to look at each individual case of these violent offenders and assess, what is their ability to pay, but also what risk do they pose to the community? Because, as I said, we cannot use bail as a form of incarceration because they're innocent until proven guilty. However, if you're accused of a murder, we need to make sure you're showing up to court. We cannot have you just go off to another state or go off to another country. We need to ensure you are showing up to court. And that may be that somebody who has more means to pay gets an even higher bond amount, that they have to put up larger resources. But we need to make sure that we have a bond in place for each individual that will guarantee their appearance in court. It is too important for them to just run off.
So I'm wondering if you have in your mind, or if you've thought out or have an idea for what something that balances the need for public safety with the rights of defendants looks like.
Obviously, everybody has their inalienable rights that are given to them by the Constitution, and we are never in a place where we want to violate anyone's civil rights. And what we really try to focus with the community is, please, please, you have to let us know if you are mistreated by an officer. I mean, I'm sure this room does not know that last year we had about 1,000 complaints on our officers, 2 million citizen contacts, 1,000 complaints. You know how many were actually from the public? Less than 240. That means we made contact with 2 million people last year, and only 240 people thought that they were mistreated in some way or had a complaint. The rest were all internal complaints that we made on each other, which, by the way, kind of shatters that blue wall of silence that everybody likes to always put out there. Our officers are policing one another, and it shows in the statistics. I'm sorry, but those are the facts. I'm not speaking for everywhere else, but I'm speaking for right here in Houston.
So I'm wondering how that would jive with the idea that, I think a lot of people, when they look at policing on a national scale, when they look at policing in their own communities, there is this sense that it doesn't even make sense to complain, or it doesn't even make sense to bring things up when you see people, for instance, when you see officers involved in fatal shootings, when you see officers involved in brutality, who then basically wind up either on leave with pay or back on the beat. So I'm wondering how you would then bridge that gap between the idea that people should report on officers and the idea that there's no point in reporting on officers because nothing will be done about it.
Well, I would disagree, and I think my membership would probably disagree, that the department does follow through. They do suspend police officers when they're found guilty of things, and officers are indicted. We had 2 officers probably about 6 months ago that were indicted for off-duty shooting incidents. But that doesn't really make the news when they are indicted. It's more of when they're not indicted on a case. But what I ask everyone is, look at every individual case, look at the facts, because that's what we have to deal with. And I know in a world right now where each side of the political spectrum, I mean, we even have alternative facts now, which I didn't even think was a thing, but apparently it is now. But I ask everyone to look at the facts of each individual case and then make your judgment based on that. Don't make it on a singular statement from somebody that said, oh, I saw this. Wait for the entire investigation to get done and then make an assessment on what occurred. And you know what? departments nationwide need to do a better job of getting that information out there. After there's an officer-involved shooting or a use of force, sometimes there's a vacuum, and that vacuum ultimately gets filled by people who want their 15 minutes or they want to get on the news, instead of a department saying, we're going to release this video right away so you see exactly what happened.
So I want to go a little deeper on this. You know, obviously, some things were just said, and there were obviously people in the audience who felt like...
I understand.
Right, so how can we bridge that gap? How do you think the police union can help bridge that gap?
You know, once again, it's just community involvement and going out and sharing this information. I'm sure before I walked into this room today, y'all assumed that we have hundreds of shooting by our officers in the city of Houston. Last year, we had 2 million citizen contacts. We had 15 officer-involved shootings. 15. And in addition to that, if the community wanted to make an investment in the police department and increase our staffing to a point where we could have 2 officers in every single car, we'd probably drive that number down to 5. I mean, it's right there in front of us if we have the will and the money that we're willing to do that. And I think that's an important statistic that people don't understand. 2 million citizen contacts, 15 officer-involved shootings, and only about 240 complaints from the public. I mean, the numbers don't bear out that our officers are doing a bad job. Am I saying that all of my officers are perfect? Absolutely not. There is absolutely 1% to 2% that are out there not doing the job the way they should, which is why we want you to come forward and tell us about it, because guess what? They make the rest of us look bad. There is nothing more upsetting than an officer who's out there committing crimes, because it makes us all look bad.
So you're in the midst of renegotiating the union contract. I think the community has been calling for more transparency. It's something you've talked about. I'm wondering what you are thinking is of primary importance as you renegotiate that contract.
Primary importance for us is always money.
Yeah.
It makes the world go round, folks. We are, as I said, we are amidst the worst manpower crisis in this country right now for officers. And I think what the community truly calls for is they want quality people policing their communities. They want smart, intelligent, really thought-driven people. And we get that by putting out a good salary, a good benefit package that attracts the best candidates. Because if we don't have a competitive package, they're going to go to Austin. They're going to go to Fort Worth. And if the community wants the absolute best police force that they can have, that does cost money. We want to be competitive in the marketplace so that we're attracting all of the people that we need to be in our department. We want the best of the best to be here. We already have some of the best police officers in the entire world, but we want the best of the best coming through the door.
I want to let the audience know that we will be coming to you for questions in just a few minutes. So again, if you could start thinking about them, condensing them on down, and there are mic runners on either side. So you mentioned pay, which is obviously going to be part of the contract. Are there initiatives related to transparency, body cameras, anything else that you think should be part of that contract that would further some of what you were talking about when it comes to letting the community see what police officers are doing?
Well, as you know, our body camera policy isn't even subject to bargaining. I mean, this is the department's realm. If they would like to change things, or if the community would like to see change things on body camera policy, you know, they can certainly talk to the department and talk to the mayor and talk to city council. But I feel like we already have one of the best body camera policies as far as transparency for the community is concerned.
So earlier when we were talking in a few panels, the issue of policing immigrant communities came up. Obviously, that is a point of tension and increasing tension. I'm wondering how you were thinking about that going forward.
You know, what I always like to make clear to the immigrant community here in Houston is we are here to help you. Do not ever, ever feel nervous about calling us if you need help. Okay? Our officers are not showing up to ask you about your immigration status. They're showing up to help you. So if you are the victim of a crime, please, please come forward, call the police. We are here to help you. We do not want to deport you. And in fact, our officers do not have the time to be going around asking people's immigration status. We are running call to call to call. We are paper thin, folks. Paper thin. I cannot stress that enough, and you're seeing it in our response times. We're here to help you, so please call us if you need us.
Do you think that there are any trainings needed or additional trainings needed of police officers when it comes to dealing with communities of color?
Oh, I think there's always increased training. I mean, every year we have cultural training here at the department so that we keep up. And not only that, we have to keep up with the changing demographics of our community. It's important that officers understand what cultures are in their community and that they're educated on them. And as you know, Houston is a majority minority city, just like we are a majority minority department. Maybe another fact that folks didn't know here. And we pride ourselves in being able to connect with the community, but we have to keep up because we have new communities moving in every day.
I want to give the audience a chance to ask their questions. I see one back there already.
Can I hold it? Thank you. Hi. My name is Steven Zorosco. I'm with All Real Radio, and I want to attach a question that you had with Ed Gonzalez due to the rise in violent crime that you referenced. And I want to ask, I know you're a part of the union representation and the membership, but one of the reasons why there's a high increase of violent crimes is a lot due to hate crimes, mostly white supremacist, right-wing inspired hate crimes. And this is the ideology that's actually been attached to law enforcement through reports saying that white supremacist organizations have infiltrated law enforcement. So is this on your radar, and are you addressing it?
Okay, I certainly don't think there's any white supremacists or any white supremacist groups within our department, but let me be clear right now, we do not tolerate hate crimes. We are an accepting city here. We want this to be a melting pot, and we want everyone to feel welcome. So if there is someone that is committing hate crimes, we absolutely need to know about it, and we're going to make sure we prosecute them to the fullest and get them off the streets. We don't need them in our community.
Do we have other questions? Right there.
Again, I'm Pastor James Nash. In your mind, do you think it's fair to take a person that has not committed a crime, immigrant, and put them in jail? Do you think in your mind that's right? Because let me say this, you take families. That was an incident not happened not too long ago. Man just worked, made a living for his family, never bothered anybody, but ended up being deported. Do you think it's right?
I don't think it's right for anybody to be put in jail who hasn't committed a crime. I mean, it's what our country's built on. Of course not.
All right, do we have, I think there's one right there in the middle.
My name is Jenny Rebecca. I have a quick question. You kept on reiterating the fact that there were over 2 million citizen contacts. And only 15 officer-involved shootings. Are you proud of that?
No, I mean, I'd love that number to be 0, but the fact of the matter was it was a historic low for us, so that's progress. You know, I'd much rather have 15 officer-involved shootings than 45. I would love for that number to be 0. Listen, none of our officers want to be involved in a shooting, and I'm going to get personal for a second. I've actually been involved in an officer-involved shooting about 13 years ago when I was a police officer in New York City. It was not a fun experience. I had nightmares afterwards. I struggled with that for a long time, and it was a completely justified shooting. The individual shot at me, I shot back. But none of our officers want to be involved in a shooting. None of them wake up in the morning and say, I really hope I go through this life-altering event that is going to affect me for the rest of my life. So no, I would love for that number to be 0.
And I think we have another question right back there.
My name is David Medina. I'm with Rice University. What is the ethnic breakdown of the police department?
So we are a majority and minority department, as I've discussed previously. I don't have the exact breakdown, but we have more minorities on this department than we do have, as other places. And we actually were the ones that brought this on because we agreed with the city in our meet and confer agreement that the department can hire whoever they want as long as they meet standards. The civil service test isn't given until they're actually in the academy. So we have a majority-minority department because the department is allowed to hire whoever they want as long as they meet standards. And that was something that we brought to the table because we wanted our police department to reflect the community we serve.
Jillian? Yes. Oh, right over there.
Hi, my name is Rebecca French. I'm an independent artist. And my question is, I didn't really catch your answer to the question about whether or not police officers are mandated to wear body cameras or not in Houston.
Oh, okay. Yes, absolutely. Every officer that's on patrol has to wear a body camera.
Okay. I think we can grab one more right there.
Okay. Good afternoon. Good morning. My name is Dr. Dorsey. I'm retired Texas Department of Criminal Justice. I have a two-part question. The body cam. I've talked to officers, and some of them don't even have body cams yet because of finances. Okay.
Every officer on patrol has a body camera.
I'm just telling you what they told me.
There may be investigators that don't have them, but every officer that's on patrol has one.
Okay. Number two, let me reiterate, you said that you will come and talk to the communities.
As far as in general? Yeah, absolutely. Invite me out to the different events that you want to have. I've come out before. I've come to Q&As. As long as I'm invited and I can make it, I'm going to be there because I want people to have this conversation, and I want to be able to talk about the great things we're doing and the great job my officers are doing.
Okay. All right.
All right. Everyone, please join me in thanking Officer Grimaldi for his time.
Next, Communities Look Ahead. Joining Jillian on stage, Brandy Holmes, a community organizer and strategist for Black Lives Matter Houston. Cesar Espinoza, the executive director of Fiel Houston, and Alicia Miles, the director of operations at West Street Recovery.
All right, so I figured we would start this off. I want you guys, as people who are out in the community, talking to people, advocating for them, to talk to me about what you see as the biggest needs, the biggest challenges that these communities are facing when it comes to issues of criminal justice and policing. And Alicia, I want to start with you.
Sure. I think the biggest challenge that we're facing is a lack of support for community organizations. When you sit in a room with officials and you ask them if they can name grassroots and other community organizations that are actively working in the communities providing case management, they cannot name them. The only one that comes up is My Brother's Keeper. And I think that recognizing who those organizations are, who those organizers are, and actively supporting their work is going to help alleviate the pressure that they feel on their criminal justice system. And I don't see that support in the communities.
All right, Cesar.
Number one, thank you all for being here. Thank you for inviting us. I'm glad this is a 12-hour program because, there's so much to discuss and there's so much, this can't be summed up in a couple of minutes. But one of the things that our community faces, and I work with the immigrant community, 600,000 undocumented people live in the greater Houston area, meaning that 1 out of every 10 Houstonians is undocumented, like myself. And one of the things that we face is not only do we face the criminal justice system, but then we face a new term that's called crimmigration, where immigration is being criminalized more so than ever before. Folks are getting picked up at the jail, and they're being bonded only to be released to ICE. And these are real things that are happening. Coupled with that, or on top of that, you have laws like SB 4 that were passed last session that frankly just scared our community. And our folks are in many ways suffering, not only in economically, but also in their family nucleuses. We know of families that do not go out as a family to the park because they're afraid that they're going to get picked up as a family unit. So this is really disrupting people's lives. This is really turning their lives upside down.
Brandon.
I think one thing that's really interesting, and first off, thank you so much for having me here as well. I'm really enjoying and really excited to be a part of this conversation. I think one thing that's interesting and that I've heard from and have yet to hear from some of the different panels is that one of the biggest issues that are facing particularly the Black community is the fact that we have failed to name that the structures that exist currently are racist structures. There's systemic racial issues that exist in the criminal justice system here in Harris County, and we have yet to name those things. We have yet to name the ways in which white supremacy affects Black and brown communities in the city of Houston. We've talked about the jail and the jail being populated by a certain person, but we have yet to quantify who that individual is. In the jail, you're seeing 56% of those people who are currently housed in the jail are Black folks. You add in the figure and include our brown brothers and sisters, and that ratchets that number up to 75%. 75% of Black and brown folks are currently, or 75% of the population in the jail are Black and brown folks, but yet we have yet to name what are the causes and conditions that exist to put those people there in the first place. There are systemic racist issues that have created these structures, and until we can name those things, until we can say the word racism, until we can say the words white supremacy, until we can say the word structural racism and mass incarceration, the ways in which that influences that, I think it's really going to restrict the ways in which we can move forward.
I'm wondering how each of you thinks about the balance of public safety versus over-policing. And Cesar, I want to start with you because, as you mentioned, in immigrant communities in particular, there's a lot of nuance to think about when it comes to involving the police, calling the police.
I think it's important to remind everybody that even as an undocumented immigrant, we want to be safe too. And that's what a lot of people, they hide public safety or they hide their anti-immigrant sentiment calling it public safety. There's a Chief Acevedo released a statement about a year ago now that said that people reporting rape, women reporting rape in the Latino community is down 40%. That does not mean the rape is not happening. It's just people are so afraid to come forward. And that in the end is going to hurt you, it's going to hurt me, because we're going to have these people who are running around who have not paid for their crimes and who are just running around free. There's been instances in Houston of gangs targeting undocumented immigrants, specifically males, on Fridays and Saturday nights, knowing that they carry cash, and targeting them and stealing from them, knowing that they will not report crimes to the police. So obviously it's an issue. It's an issue that's going to grow under SB 4. It's an issue that continues to grow. And it's very difficult for groups like ourselves to go out and say, you should call the police when people associate police with ICE. So one of the things we must do is divorce ICE from police, and make sure that they're separate entities that know that local government should not be doing the federal government's job, but local government should be protecting the citizens, including the undocumented folks who live among us. So it's really important to make that separation, and for us to know that this does have implications. I now have a work permit under the DACA program, which could end at any time, but I'm still very afraid when a police officer pulls up behind me. I automatically think, what did I do? Did I do something wrong? Is this it? So it's very important that we get to the root of the problem, that we divorce police from ICE, and that we move forward as a community together.
Alicia, how are you thinking about it?
I think the same sentiment can be said for the Black community. There's a lot of talk about policy-wise around creating this better relationship with the police in the community, where you have to recognize that the individuals that are being shot and killed by police are young individuals, 13 to 24. These individuals they don't have an issue with how to communicate with other people. And when we tell Black and brown children, when we pass legislation that says by the time a child graduates high school, they will have to take a class on how to properly interact with the police, what you are saying is, because your skin is different, you have to behave differently. I have a young brown child. She is very intelligent. As a mother, it is against everything I stand for to tell my intelligent child who knows how to speak her mind that when you see a certain type of person, you are no longer allowed to be yourself. That's taking away our humanity. And so when we talk about over-policing, the question that policy is trying to answer is how to prove that there are good police. We're not asking that question. We know that. We're not stupid. We know that all police aren't bad. That's not the question we're asking. The question we're asking is, how do you retrain the officers that have a bias? How do you help them recognize their bias so that they don't approach situations in that manner? That's the question that we need answered.
I'm wondering, do you guys have any thoughts on how that can be done, how police can be retrained, if you guys have seen any promising ideas or models? That's a no? It's a no across the board?
No, I mean, I think it's important to, it's exactly what you said, and I wholeheartedly agree with it. One of the things that worries us about this new proposed course is that there's no talks of working with undocumented youth on how they should also respond or work with police and things like that. And we were talking about last night is, we as a community should not be worried about being ourselves, about existing, but rather we should tackle the systems that are in place that make these things happen and make tragedies happen. And we really, it's a fine balance, because at the end of the day, we all want to go home and, and enjoy our evening or enjoy the rest of our day, but we cannot ignore the fact that there are officers who have big biases. I've heard it from officers myself. In rallies, we see it when there's anti-immigrant people protesting against us. They enforce laws on us that they don't enforce on them. And when we try to call them out, they just tell us to shut up, that we don't know the laws according to them. So we're not saying that all officers are bad, but there has to be an active search and an active need and want to include community in the conversation so that we can know how to move forward together.
So I think based on some of the conversations that have been had on stage and the conversation we're having now, it seems that there is a pretty sizable gap between how communities say they feel about policing and their relationship with the police and what the police say that they are willing to offer communities and how they feel about communities. I'm wondering if you guys think it's possible to bridge that gap. Brandy, I want to start with you.
I really struggle with this, obviously. I think what we're seeing is a real crisis of imagination. Claudia Rankin said it really poignantly, I think, when she said that because white men cannot police their imagination, black men are dying. And I think what we're seeing here is that what is rooted in the fear of black and brown folks in these communities is based upon reality. It's based upon what I see in my interactions on a daily basis with law enforcement. When I call law enforcement, in particular, I was at a meeting in the Sunnyside community here, not too far away from here, a couple weeks ago, and there was comments about public safety. While these individuals in the community are very concerned about public safety, they're also very concerned about the ways in which they're vilified when they call law enforcement. One elder mentioned that when she called law enforcement, they came to confront her about, why are you calling us? What have you done? Show me your ID. Show me your information. What are you doing about this issue? So I think what we really have to look at, and I think there's ways in which the gaps can be bridged, but we do have to recognize that these fears that some law enforcement have for some individuals in community, particularly black and brown community, are rooted in this imaginative, in this way in which they shape and view the black body, the way in which the black and brown body has been criminalized, right? We think about who is a criminal, right? Who is a drug dealer now? Who is an immigrant, right? We listen to this rhetoric that is coming up and very prevalent. They're murderers, they're drug dealers, right? Who do we imagine when we hear those words? We're not thinking about a white boy, right? And so I think we have to really start to, what I mentioned earlier, name these things. And I think that law enforcement has to name these things as well. And we cannot continue to act as if these incidents are isolated. This is a widespread problem. And until we address those things, I think you're going to continue to see a gap.
I'm wondering if you guys are hearing conversations in communities or how you were thinking about the recent spate that we've seen of police being called by other civilians in an attempt to criminalize what ends up being completely normal and non-criminal behavior from people of color. I'm wondering what things like that, what instances like that consistently do to communities that already have fraught relationships with the police. Alicia, I must start with you.
It's self-explanatory. It continues to break down that relationship because when you don't have proper training of those public service officials, if your job is to protect and serve and you have not been properly trained on how to do that, if a white person can call the police on me for walking down a sidewalk, and when you show up, because you're going to show up because it's your job to show up, but you haven't been trained on how to respond, then you attack me as a criminal for walking on a sidewalk, as opposed to letting that white person know, sweetheart, it's not illegal. There's nothing wrong with her sleeping on her college campus. She has done nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with having a barbecue in a park, and no one wants to look at white faces and say, you're nuts. You are just afraid, and you being afraid is not an emergency. Nothing has happened to you. You are safe. You are at home. And until we can train our public service officials, we can train these public servants on how to look at white faces and say, I understand privilege, and I know that it is, I'm pre-wired to respect and do what you tell me to do, but I need to look at you and say, this is not an emergency. Don't call me and say, there's a man next door with a hammer and I'm afraid. He's a construction worker, ma'am. He's doing his job. Find something else to be afraid for.
Could I tag on to that?
Absolutely.
So while it is responsibility of law enforcement, and we've seen some incidents, right, with the handyman incident, where that was just like, look, this dude is he's working on this house. He bought this house. He's doing this thing. He's just trying to make a couple coins. We also see incidents like in the instance of Starbucks, right, where law enforcement does have an opportunity to say, you know what, no, ma'am, They are just doing what everybody does at Starbucks. They're coming in, they're listening to a little bit of your soft music, they're enjoying a caramel macchiato. They're just trying to do what people do at Starbucks. They're waiting on their friends, they're doing what they're doing. But yet, and still, law enforcement chose to take that individual in. Why? Because that's what has historically happened in the past. Black and brown folks charged with loitering, charged with trespassing, charged with vagrancy, when we know all they're doing is existing. And that's the ways in which they go to continue to fulfill these jails, right? That's the way they go to continue to fill the Harris County Jail. Look at the Harris County Jail. I don't have the figures because they don't provide them, but you look at the Harris County Jail and look at the individuals that are sitting there who have not committed any violent crime. So they're just there because they existed and they happen to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. Individual who may have some sort of issue around mental health. Individual who may have some sort of issue around struggling with addiction. If that person was of a fair skin tone of a white person, we call that an opioid crisis. But if the person is black, we call that a war on drugs. Yep. Right? Yep. So, I mean, when you see these very staunch differences, we look at the opioid crisis now. They're investing millions and millions of dollars in rehabilitation services. Let a black person we can't get our rehabilitation services at Harris County Jail, as these officials have pointed out before, as it's become a repository for mental health and for drug addiction. Black and brown folks are not afforded the luxury of having drug addiction. We're not afforded the luxury of having mental health issues.
Stealing candy bars.
Children
can't steal candy
And we
bars.
haven't even mentioned survival crimes, right? Like, let's get to the real root of the issue. Why is this individual even participating in this activity in the first place? Well, it's because maybe I can't feed my child. So maybe I'm stealing this candy bar because I'm going to refund this money so I can buy some Similac so my child can eat. Maybe I'm trying to pay my rent. Let's talk about the real disparities that exist in wealth, education, HISD, and all these other institutions that exist in this city that create conditions for individuals to have to even consider participating in this behavior in the first place.
Cesar, it seemed like you had to get in there.
I mean, and like I said, this is such a layered issue because for an undocumented immigrant, this can mean a totally different thing in terms of like if we commit a crime or even if we're charged with a crime now, because of the policies that have been set up, we can in effect be deported. And we know people that have been deported and how this deteriorates the communities. People hear this. We have this thing we call the Comadre Network where everybody talks to each other. It's really good for organizing, but also very good for spreading rumors and fears. And what people talk about it, and people talk about, you know, that police are going after them, that ICE is going after them, and it goes back to the root of the problem that we must separate these two entities so that one of them can do their job and doesn't have to do what somebody else's job in order to keep communities safe. But it has severe repercussions in the community. You know, I wish this was this needs to be in a city such as big as Houston, as important as Houston, who claims to be the most diverse city in the United States. We need to have those hard conversations where we talk about how we can set the example for the rest of the country on how we're going to reform ourselves and how we're going to work together to make our communities more safer.
I want to let the audience know, you guys know what the deal is. I will be coming to you for questions in just 1 second, so get those hands up, condense them down, and there are mic runners on either side. I'm wondering, after everything we've talked about, what are the things that local and state leaders need to know and be doing to create change? Alicia, I want to start with you.
They need to not exist in, I know the term I hear a lot is silos. So you sit in these silos as policymakers and change makers, and you talk to each other about what these problems are in communities that you don't belong to. And you have no idea how to fix or help or serve those communities because you don't belong to them. It's your job to provide consequences to these community members, and you don't open up the door and you don't allow those community members to come into these silos, to enter these bubbles, and give you real problems that they are facing so that you can provide those solutions. And I think a lot of this is when we talk about criminal justice, and it's really easy to say the criminal justice system has become a catch-all for mental health, has become a catch-all for, you know, people who are experiencing homelessness, has become a catch-all for drug addiction. Well, if you want to combat those things, you need to go back to those communities and find a way to support and address those problems before they get to you. Because it's one thing to say that this is what we do, and this is, as the criminal justice system, we've been tasked with, we have to take in all these people that do this, but you're also not helping find a solution for that. if you want to recognize that someone has a mental health issue, turning them away just by saying, oh, well, we released them, so that counts toward our percentage. They're not in the jail anymore, but they're back on the street, so guess what they're gonna do? They're gonna be back. You have not provided any course for them to go through. You haven't provided any organization. You haven't sent them directly to an individual that can continue their case management in a community level. And those programs exist, those organizations exist, but you don't want to hear those things. And I think policymakers need to make sure that the questions they're answering are questions that are actually being asked. And that seems like that's where the disconnect really is.
Cesar and Brandy, do you want to quickly tack on to that?
I think it's important that, to echo what Lisa said, I think it's important that folks go out there and talk to communities. There's many concerns and there's many things that pop up, and there's aggregated pressures put on our community. For example, Harvey. A lot of people, as Houstonians, we suffered through Harvey. But undocumented immigrants, we suffered even more. We didn't get access to FEMA money. We didn't get access to a lot of things. So rebuilding our lives and coming back to what we used to have is 10 times more difficult. And folks need to be aware of those situations. And for elected officials, I mean, we need elected officials to have the guts to call these things out and to pass policies. It's good on rhetoric to say we're a welcoming city, we're in this and that, but what are you doing about it? Not just talk about it, but be about it. Because we're doing the work in the community. We need you to do your work where we put you so that we can protect our communities even more. And we need you to stand up when injustice is there. We need you to be the person who calls for justice and stand up for our community, because that's what you're there for.
Yep. Brandy, do you have a quick response?
And I would say yes to all of that, and I think the solution is equity. And I think we talk about equality far too often, and that's not going to solve the problem. Equity is going to take a personalized approach and look at that individual community, that individual, and say what is needed for this person to at least get to a level in which they can even consider thinking about thriving. You look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Many of our people are just at the base. We have our basic needs are not being met. How then are we expected to self-actualize, right? This whole concept of pulling yourself up by your own bootstrap does not exist for Black and brown folks. Look at the wealth gap. What was the recent statistic that was published? It'll take 3,000, I don't know, 15,000 years before Black folk have enough money. That's not right, but don't go ahead and fact check that. But the point is that there are so many gaps that exist that the only way to solve the problem is equity. And that's what I think we need to move towards.
All right, we want to quickly go to the audience. I think there's one right there.
So, my name is Mohammed Maroof. I'm with Kip Houston High School. I'm a principal there. I can't help but notice, but of the 9 people before you, 2 of them were people of color. And as we talk about policymakers and as we talk about disrupting the systems that continuously oppress the students who I serve every day, how do we make sure that those students become the voices at the table so that we can create change?
All right, can we have one person take that, Cesar?
Yeah. I think it's really important, I think it's really funny when people call me a troublemaker. And the reason for that is because I don't think what we're doing is making trouble, but in fact, we're talking or we're bringing up the issues of justice and what should be done. We're not being idealistic, we're talking about what should be done. So one of the things that I talk to, because we work a lot with high school students, is get them used to going to city council, going to Austin. Traveling to DC should not be the abnormal thing, the crazy thing. It should be what we're all doing to make sure that our community's voices are heard and raised and that we get the change done in the end. So my little sister, she's 12 years old. She's already been to several city council meetings. She's traveled with me to Austin, to Washington, to advocate for immigration reform, and she's only 12. So I think that's one of the things that we must do with all of our kids.
I know that you guys have plenty more questions and we could talk about this all day, but we're going to stop here. Please join me in thanking our panel.
For a look at the state of the state, please welcome Ana Yanez Correa, the Director of Community Engagement, Harris County Precinct 1, and Mark Levin, the Vice President of Criminal Justice Policy at the Texas Public Policy Foundation and Right on Crime. Leading the conversation is Atlantic contributing editor Allison Stewart.
So thanks everybody for being here, and Mark is being really great by being here because he's got to catch a flight, so if he just disappears, that's why. Okay. In researching this, you can get flooded with statistics. They become overwhelming. It kind of takes over the conversation. But there was one that I saw I thought was really interesting and pertained to this conversation, and that's that federal prisons hold 1 in 8 imprisoned Americans, so that mass incarceration really is a state issue. And these two have worked together, even though they come at the issue from different sides. They wrote an article together called Correcting the Texas Justice System. It was for the Fort Worth Star, and it went viral. Name of your company, name of your organization is Right on Crime. Yeah. You are a conservative. This is your issue. So in 2007, there seemed to be some bipartisanship around this issue. Before that, one of your colleagues said, quote, "No one in conservative think tanks worked on criminal justice other than to advocate for more prisons and more incarceration." First of all, why was that the case? And then why did it shift around 2007?
Well, it goes back to, I think, the Willie Horton scandal. And, you know, criminal justice became a third rail in American politics, and no one wanted to be seen as soft on crime. Now, kind of like Nixon went to China, conservative politicians are, I think, less susceptible to those attacks. So they're in a unique position to be able to lead. Of course, not all of them really wanted to lead. But in 2007, we hit a crossroads. Unlike the federal government, states have to balance the budget. And we were facing building 17,000 more prison beds, and we couldn't staff the ones we had. So Anna and I, working with legislative leaders, we were able to help draft a plan where now we've closed 8 prisons, we've put in a lot more treatment, and we got a lot more work to do, though. You know, Texas is now, instead of 3rd, we're 6th in terms of our incarceration rate, but it's still unacceptably high. But I think that what's changed is, you know, if you believe in limited government, you believe in redemption, you have to apply those principles that you say you believe in other areas to criminal justice as well. And we've been able to get many conservatives to recognize that.
Did you go at the fiscal argument first?
I think we always say that saving money is the appetizer that brings policymakers to the table, but the main course is keeping families together, more public safety, getting people jobs instead of being incarcerated, and obviously the idea of it's part of every major religious tradition that people can change and find a new path in life, whether that's through spiritual change or otherwise. So, but I do think the fiscal issue is what brings folks to the table.
Conservative folks to the table. I know. There's this place where this diverse group, there's a Venn diagram where you have religious folks, like Mark mentioned, liberal folks, conservative folks, where they cross over, and criminal justice reform is one of those places where they have agreement on the issue. What is it going to take to keep that Venn diagram in place so that this just isn't a moment? Right now, criminal justice reform is having its moment. How do we keep those folks at the table working together?
I mean, I'm looking at it right now, right? It's going to take the public. It's going to take the public to continue to fight for what is right, the public to continue to demand for reforms that are not just a little bit of reform here, a little bit of reform there, but transformative reforms. And honestly, the public is way ahead of the politician. The youth organizing that is going on around in this country is inspiring. The mamas and daddies whose children are in the system fighting for reform is amazing, right? Like, the public has always realized, communities of color have always realized the purpose of the criminal justice system. And it was not for public safety purposes. It was to disenfranchise, it was to undermine, it was to devastate communities. And now with social media, with activism, with mobilization, with movement building, it's not stopping. It is not stopping. People have woken up, and that's going to continue. And fiscal conservatives understand they're not getting their bang for the return. They're not getting the public safety outcomes in the name of public safety based on failed criminal justice policies. And also real, the coalitions that right and left have built started with the intent of for our various reasons, started with the intent of let's reduce costs and increase public safety. But friendships have developed throughout the years that are not going to go away. I was able to work in my previous job in 9 different states. And they're difficult states to work, like Arizona, in Louisiana, in Georgia, in Michigan. And the trajectory of a real, genuine coalition continues. Not without its challenges, but it continues. So it's not, this isn't a moment. This is gonna continue to happen.
When we talk about the fiscal argument, you know it, Mark, there are many towns that their entire economy is based around prisons. How do you talk to those folks, those conservative folks who say, like, you know what, no, prisons need to stay in our towns. This means jobs. This is our economy. This is our livelihood.
Well, I mean, I think that's, from a conservative philosophical standpoint, it's a very simple thing, that it's not the role of government to create jobs, it's the role of the private sector. We shouldn't have one more prison than we need simply as a source of jobs. Now, but I do realize, obviously, in rural areas where you have a prison town, that has been an obstacle in some places, not so much in Texas. I think, for one thing, in Texas, there's a turnover of over 5,000 prison guards every year. So usually they can be, unfortunately, we still have over 100 prisons, they can be put into a nearby prison, and so it's not like they have to lose their job. You know, Anna's absolutely right about the coalition. So there's the Smart on Crime Texas Coalition, and we've got, you know, Texas Association for Business, Texas Criminal Justice Coalition, which Anna started and did amazing work at. Goodwill, no one can object to Goodwill. The ACLU, some people object to the ACLU, but us as the conservatives, Prison Fellowship, we're going to have a huge, Texas Association of Business, the biggest state business group. So it's a powerful coalition, and we just released our legislative agenda, which includes bail reform, drug sentencing reform, a lot of other things we can talk about.
Philosophically, Anna, how do you feel about the fact that, you know, there are organizations like the Koch brothers, big money coming in from outside to support, they happen to support criminal justice reform. They probably don't support other things that you agree with, things about climate change. What do you think about that kind of big money coming from outside the state to support an issue, even if you believe in it, while you might not believe in other things?
The failures of the criminal justice system has touched everybody, white, brown, rich, not rich, and a lot of the people that have joined forces, they are starting to realize the devastating effects of what we have done to communities. Many of the people that are Republican, conservative, themselves are starting to experience the impact. And so I say, come on down. Let's work together with the understanding that we will agree to disagree on the things, and we will fight you tooth and nail to make sure that there's justice on all issues, but with an understanding that we have to open the doors. And our office is one that, if you want to do right by the people, if you want to create justice, we're going to work with you. And they know that we're going to fight you on other issues, right?
Where do you guys disagree? Where do you, on this issue, where do you disagree?
Listen, back in the day, I remember that, you know, we started working in 2005, and I remember Mark Levin, you know, coming up and it's like, hey, I have this proposal. It's going to save a lot of money. And I was like, okay, buddy, what is it? What is it? And it was a proposal that did not make legislation. It didn't go. It was just one of those like discussions. And it was, you know, we have the state jail system. Let's privatize it. And I remember being like, oh, I have been waiting for this moment. I'm going to roll up my sleeves, and because we have been aligned in so many different issues. And on the privatization of services and privatization of prisons, we just, it just was not going anywhere. And the proposal, it didn't happen. And what was really nice about it is that a couple of years after, when the private prisons presented a letter to all the governors saying, if you keep your capacity in prisons by 90%, we will run your facilities. Without me saying anything, he wrote this letter to Governor Perry at the time saying, no, this is unsustainable, this is not gonna work. So I say this as an example because we may start ideologically on things that we don't agree on, but through collaboration, through coalition, through having hard discussions, you start building that momentum so that people can see eye to eye.
Yeah, and a lot of the 8 prisons we've closed in Texas have been private prisons. And the nice thing about the contracts in Texas is they can terminate them at any time. Absolutely, these occupancy guarantees that some other states like Arizona have are terrible. I mean, Marriott would like an occupancy guarantee from the government, but what could be a worse worse idea than the government guaranteeing profits for a private company.
That's right.
Mark, a Texas Defender Service reporter told a reporter, if you change something in Harris County, if you reform it, you actually have the capacity to affect the rest of the state of Texas. And in fact, given our visibility, you have the capacity to impact justice systems around the country. First of all, do you agree with that? And what do you think that's been done here, reforms here, that have had a major impact?
Well, the number one thing, which Kim may have talked about, is diverting people, pretrial diversion for less than a gram. A few thousand fewer people are now being sent to state jail from Harris County than previously. And the reason is these folks were choosing, it's counterintuitive, but they were choosing state jail over probation. But by offering a pretrial diversion where there's the incentive of no adjudication, no conviction, you go through a treatment program, these individuals are now choosing. And the bail part is a critical part, offering the pretrial diversion immediately so someone doesn't languish in jail because they can't afford bail, and they're getting 2 or 3 for 1. So by the time they would end up being adjudicated, they have all this credit, so there's virtually no time left in state jail versus up to 5 years of probation. So what we're going to be doing at the state level next session is trying to make this a statewide presumption of pretrial diversion on your first less than a gram of drug possession. And and then the bail reform, obviously, which is stemmed from the lawsuit. I hope very much that we will be able to pass a statewide bail reform measure, which includes things like presumptive non-financial release for low-risk defendants. I think that it's quite clear that counties across the state are wasting money keeping people in jail simply because they can't afford bail. And we've really got to, what we have to do is make sure that the in-out decision is totally separated from any financial conditions, because it should be based entirely on public safety and risk of flight. Considering someone's ability to pay is completely contrary to due process, the Equal Protection Clause, and who we are as a country.
What's something that could change in Harris County that you think could have an impact statewide and potentially nationally?
When you look at who represents, how many members of the legislature come from Harris County? I mean, that is a very powerful voting bloc. And not, if the criminal justice system can be transformed, when the criminal justice system is transformed in Harris County, that's going to send a signal to all of the 254 counties that, okay, we need to get going. And nationwide, in all of the travels that we've done, people look at Texas. People see Texas as a critical player of reform. In a lot of the states that we've done work in, people don't ask us, no offense to those states, what is California doing? Although California is doing, for example, incredible work, they ask, what is Texas doing? So we have an opportunity to change not only the culture, but to change the narrative, to provide a vision for the community that will heal the community, that will address the trauma that people of color have been facing. And it's no stopping. You have leadership. You have our office who is like wide open to coordinate and to work with people who really want to see reform. It's unstoppable. The reforms that have taken place in Harris County have been great, but we still have a long way to go. And since we're talking about race and justice, race and ethnicity, data collection, need to be discussed throughout every single state of the decision-making process.
Mark, I was going to ask you, what is Right on Center doing about racial disparities in the criminal justice?
That's a great question. It does start with data. Florida passed a great data bill this year, which we supported. They didn't pass that much else, unfortunately, but they're behind Texas otherwise. But it's a great data collection bill. I mean, I guess it was a year or two ago, it came out, DPS was just classifying Hispanic drivers, people pulled over, as white. So, I mean, it tells you how behind the times some of these systems are. I think that for us, the challenge is that, obviously policing, police tend to spend the most time in areas where there's high crime rates, and particularly property and violent crime, and that's sensible. But one of the byproducts of that is we know all races use drugs in the same levels, but African Americans are much more likely to be arrested for marijuana and other drug possession. So if we don't have some way of addressing that later in the system, we're going to have unfair outcomes. And one of the other issues is with regard to risk assessment, which we strongly support using that instead of money in terms of looking at who's released from jail. But I think that you can adjust for these racial issues, for example, by excluding drug possession convictions from those risk assessment scores, because we know that that is, whether someone has a drug possession record is going to depend in large measure on where they happen to live, how they got their drugs. Wealthier people get them more surreptitiously. So there's ways we can make adjustments without any detriment to public safety. I would argue even strengthening the emphasis on the factors that actually correlate to risk of harming another person, not a risk that someone's going to smoke pot again.
Let's get some microphones out. I have one more question. You keep saying the word we're support, we're behind it. What does that actually mean? What does that mean you actually do?
Well, we like to say we're not just a think tank, but a do tank. So we testify, we help draft legislation, we meet with legislators and legislative staff.
You twist arms? Nicely?
Well, I mean, I think that our hope is that politicians will do the right thing, but there's other folks out there that can help them feel the heat so they see the light. But we don't get involved in campaigns and that sort of thing. We're C3.
We have questions from the audience. At all. I can keep going.
Allison?
No, right here. I'm sorry.
Ann Gorman from Angela House. In the spirit of bringing about change, what is Houston or Texas or any other significant cities of size in the United States, have they taken a hard look at the models in Europe, their criminal justice systems, where they have lower rates of incarceration and just less violence overall in their communities?
And that's what I'm talking about. We need to redefine what success looks like. Because for the communities that we serve, success is not one less revocation. Success is not one less arrest. Success is making sure that they have the needs that they need to thrive, as all of the panelists have said. And if other countries can do it, if other communities who are wealthy, who are not people of color, can benefit from resources, we can. There's over 70 million people with criminal records. We are preventing people from thriving. We are destroying their society. We are putting the value of an individual based on, oh, you're a felon, oh, you're a misdemeanor. You know, we're not looking at individuals as individuals holistically. So what we're talking about is, what do we want? Okay, you know, we can talk all day long. We don't want this, we don't want this, we don't want this. So what is it that we do want? And so that's what we need to do. We need to take responsibility. We need to join forces. We need to work together with likely, unlikely allies. And we need to demand for a vision so that we can support the men and women who have been elected, who want to go there. And we need to give them the resources. We need to push them.
Well, let me just say, I went on a tour of prisons in Germany, and it was a real revelation. Of course, they have 1/10 the incarceration rate of the U.S. They also, by the way, many youths up until 24, or young adults really, they're in the juvenile facilities. And of course, we still need to raise the age in Texas. We're one of the few states left where 17-year-olds are automatically getting adult criminal records and going to adult jails, many of which results in abuse and physical, sexual, and otherwise. So I hope we'll be able to do that next session. But the other thing about the prisons in Germany is I was really struck by how many choices every person in prison made every day. They picked ingredients for the meal. They decided what books to check out at the library. Instead of turning out people that had no ability to make decisions, I was at the Prison Entrepreneurship Program, great program here in Houston. They take folks coming out of prison out to dinner, their first meal, and they would just stare at the menu for many minutes because they haven't had to make a choice in years. And we talk about the belief in individual liberty and personal autonomy, and we're not running our prisons in a way that is consistent with that.
And why does a person have to be arrested to be able to get those resources to begin with, okay? We don't need to use the criminal justice system the way that it has so that people's needs can be met.
I'm asking one more question before you take off your mic. What doesn't Jeff Sessions understand?
It's probably a good thing I took off the mic, but we're hoping to pass something despite his views at federal prison.
What's one thing that Jeff Sessions does not understand, truly?
Well, I don't think
about this
the
issue.
Academic research that longer prison terms don't reduce recidivism. How about that?
Okay, let's thank our panel.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, good luck.
For the next generation, joining Allison, Noel Pinnock, Chief of the Houston Bureau of Youth and Adolescent Health, and Elvin Kyoto, a rising sophomore at Prairie View A&M University.
do a little housekeeping here. So Noah, when you go into work every day,
Yes.
what is your mandate? When you think about what you have to do every day, what is it?
What's my mandate on life? Well, let me tell you. I'm going to give you the short and long one. I exist to establish and make suitable provisions for the support and maintenance of an efficient cradle-to-career system to build complete communities that are essential to the preservation of liberties and the rights of all people. That's the long one. Here's the short one. Change lives in a positive way.
What is the biggest obstacle to that? Because I don't think there's anyone who would disagree with that as a daily mandate.
Let me just say this. I mean, there are tons of obstacles. Obviously, there are obstacles that are intrinsic and extrinsic to all of us. I think the motivating factor for me is that we can make a difference in the lives of the most vulnerable in our city, that can impact community, that can change the trajectory of families. I think that is incumbent upon us to know that though the mountain might seem insurmountable, that there are people, there are places, there are things that can coalesce and galvanize around things that matter, that help us to overcome those obstacles. So I look at the mountain in front of me almost upside down as a platform to get me to the next level. And it's not all just optimistic, because there's always the sentiment that, you know, we do have challenges, and I'm not discarding that. I'm not discarding that notion. However, I'm saying that the collective effort of everyone can overcome the challenges and obstacles that beset us.
You just finished your freshman year.
Yes.
How'd it go?
Freshman year was an experience. It was way different from high school. I've learned a lot of things, but one important thing that I learned about freshman year is that you have to watch who you hang around with, because not everyone has good intentions with you. So if you watch who you hang around with and put yourself around positive people, everything is going to go not perfect, but a little bit easier.
Tell me how you know Noel. Explain to folks how you know him.
The way I know Mr. Noel, the great Noel.
Oh, don't do it.
I went to Worthing High School. I grew up in Sunnyside. I went to Worthing High School, and they had this program called the PACE program. And with that, they brought the people from our class, which was the 2017 class with the highest GPAs, to be interns in the city of Houston. So we were interns for a whole year, and every 3 months they would switch us around. And the way I met Mr. Noel was through PACE, and that was my second internship, and it was the best one so far. That was number one. It was the best one.
So you mentioned you're from Sunnyside. You grew up in Sunnyside as well.
Yes, I did grow up in
Historically black
Sunnyside.
community for the people who are watching on the internet and don't know the neighborhoods. I talked about statistics earlier, how you can kind of drown in them. So I try to always find one that sort of gets at the center of the conversation.
Right.
In Sunnyside, residents have a 1 in 11 chance of being a victim of crime each year.
Right.
Talk about the people who live there and who are victims as well. Ellen, why is that? And what do you think the impact of that is on folks in your age group?
That's a great question. I remember I had moved into Sunnyside, and my first week there, I rode my bike to the gas station. I just wanted some ice cream. I came back out, my bike was not there no more. So, a person came up, oh, such and such stole your bike. So I rode with a bike. I walked back home. It was a crazy story. But I feel like it's mostly, the reason for that is mostly the kids. We, as young people, I'm not gonna say we don't have guidance or path, but we don't have any structure and no one to really tell us what to do. So it's mostly the higher kids. For example, we just finished high school and we don't have anything else to do, those type of kids. You have the kids that don't have the jobs, that don't go to school, and they don't go to the military. So what do? they stay at home. You get bored at home, you start going out and getting into trouble. So I feel like that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of crime in Sunnyside.
For when you lived in Sunnyside to Elvin's time, what's changed the most? What have you seen that really applies to what we're talking about today, race and justice?
You know, Sunnyside at one point was very vibrant. In fact, it was its own municipality before it was annexed by the city of Houston. So when I made it to Houston back in the 80s, and most people say, why did you come? I said, I had no choice. My mom and mom made us come, right? The community was very similar in nature. I mean, we had kids who rode bikes, and normally our bikes were, you know, safe when we left them outside. But ultimately, there was still this sentiment of lack in the community, because it's almost like you suck the oxygen out of a room and then there's no room for you to breathe. And so past the vibrance of Sunnyside and kind of into the terms when I became more of a young teen and growing up as a high school student, I was robbed at the age of 12, walking home from the bus stop at the corner of Ferdinand and Belfort. And the gentleman who robbed me saw that I had 2 briefcases, and I thought maybe he assumed that I was coming from work, because I always patterned my life after Michael Keaton off of Family Ties. And for those who know Michael Keaton, now I love Mike, you know. So I had a briefcase for my books, and I had a briefcase for my trumpet, which I really hated because it came from a garage shop. But in either case, he stuck a gun to my throat and said, "Give me your wallet." And so I looked down at the gun and I said, man, you could have came with a cleaner gun, and it's rusty, man. But by the way, I have $2 in my pocket, so take it. He took it. I went home alive. So the reality is victimization is real, and mostly any and every community in the city of Houston, but there are high incidences where you see that because of the economics and the social ecological systems of that community drives you to a point where you feel like, you know, I have to take rather than make. My dad, being an immigrant from Jamaica, came to this country with the notion that I don't want to take anything, I want to make everything. And mostly Jamaicans do have 15 jobs, as he did, and it was indicative because he had 15 jobs. And, you know, when you come and live in a society like that, you want to make certain that you will provide the necessary protective factors that are enabling the community to really, if they don't have boots to pull up, to go get them. And if you got to make them, make them.
We've talked a lot today. If you've been here since the beginning, I mean, I think the main underpinnings of this, one of the main underpinnings is this idea of intersectionality, that you can't talk about race and justice without talking about education, without talking about housing, without talking about job opportunities and prospects. So I guess my question is, what is it about Houston that those things, those other things that we've all talked about, aren't being watered and fed? Why are we having to talk about the end result?
That's a good question. You know, I've oftentimes said that comfort enters your home as a guest, remains as your host, and becomes your master. And when asked, they've said, what do you think is the biggest cultural deficiency in our community? I say it's the culture of comfort. It's a silent bigotry and low expectations. You know, when I was growing up in Sunnyside, I can remember all of my teachers. And I had a great mom. My mom and my dad were awesome. I have 4 brothers. I'm of a twin. And one of the things that they did, even in the home, and it's about maybe 1,200 square feet, maybe less than that, because my dad, being who he was, built on to the house, embedded in us the desire to want to do more. And, you know, we can live a few days without food, water, and shelter. And I heard someone talk about the Maslow's needs hierarchy. We cannot live one moment without hope. And so when you suck hope out of a community by not providing the equity in terms of those resources, then you're going to have the inequities in justice. You're going to have the inequities in terms of law enforcement and the criminal system. But it's all about interaction, and it's all about relationships. What we find in the city of Houston is we're not program poor. I mean, we got a lot of people with great ideas. Everybody want to file that 501c and submit that Form 990 to be a bona fide nonprofit. What we find in the city of Houston is that we're system poor. Program rich, but system poor. And so in ordinary terms, most people find that it's very difficult to work together. So what we do with My Brother's Keeper in the city of Houston, by way where we met Mr. Elvin Kyoto, by the way, is Honduras, an Honduran. Most people don't know he speaks full Spanish. Is to really bring people together and galvanize them around very specific points that we know are going to help assert the conversation into a new direction and provide and marshal resources that can address them. I can't tell you I didn't have great teachers. I had great teachers. But I can tell you that in my community, there was really no place to go, but we had a level of creativity. There was a landfill that's located right on Reed Road that we would ride our bikes down. We didn't know it was, contaminated. We just had fun, But if you ask my mom, on the other hand, where do I go get a good loaf of bread? We have to drive across town.
Get a food desert.
It's food desert. But the idea is that comfort is an enemy for change. And that when the community, I was so proud when I drove through down Belfort, or Scott, I'm sorry, and I saw the sign in the Esplanade that said, Historic Community Sunnyside. But as soon as I saw that sign, I ran over a huge pothole, and I couldn't stop at the corner store because the corner store is kind of filled with people that you may not want to, do business with, and you got to drive all the way out to 288 in Pearland to go get a nice meal or nice groceries, right? So the idea is, it's kind of the paradox of change. We can implement those small pieces, but if we don't look at it systemically, then we're always kind of biting the bullet.
I'm going to ask Noah one more question. I haven't forgotten about you, but part of, you said the word historic, and obviously in this country we have historic segregation of schools and of housing. Is all of that still present in Houston in some way?
There is always a tale of two cities. And in fact, had it not been for my transfer out of Sunnyside into the Stellar Link community, I would have never knew that tale to be true. Mm-hmm. Because when I was bused from Sunnyside and I rode down Stellar Link and I went to Pershing Middle School, I saw a whole different perspective of what life was. So is it intentional? I don't know. But if you look at Sunnyside today, you see the old pier and beam homes, the wood homes now being demolished and erecting are the new kind of slab homes on concrete slabs and things of that nature. But what has happened is the mentality of the people haven't changed. I can revitalize the community, but if I don't revitalize the heart, then it doesn't change the community the way it should. I look at the corner of Scott and OST. I used to work at the Rice supermarket right there at one point. And they literally used to beat up the shoplifters and then take a Polaroid, everybody know what a Polaroid is, right? And stick the Polaroid by the customer service booth. And they asked me one time as a high school student to go chase a shoplifter. What do you want me to do? I did what I was told. The lady had already began eating the food. So I came back and said, hey, she got it. I'm gone. But my point is that they demolished the Rice store. They erected an H-E-B here, everything's better. And the economy and that entire corridor changed. It's called a supermarket theory. So the idea is that we can look at these small kind of pockets of opportunities, but if we don't look at them systematically and address the root cause, don't buy me a new car, teach me how to drive. Mm-hmm. And if you teach me how to drive, my paradigm shift, whether I got a new car or old car, is that I'm going to be a safe driver, not only for myself, but those around us.
So Elvin, we've been talking, we're the olds, we know what Polaroids are. What is it you think that legislators and folks, even with the best intentions, don't necessarily understand about the struggles of young people of color in this city?
What I feel like they don't understand is the way that we grew up. Everyone grows up different. Nobody grows up the same. We might grow up in the same environment, but we're two different people. I feel, I don't know how to explain it, but it's just not the same. I know for a fact that I could go out to Rice University and hang out with someone my age, but we're not the same people. He might tell me something that he's been through, and I can tell him that something that I've been through, and it's just not the same connect. But I always like to learn from people, and I always like to give my story and tell them where I grew up from and how I came up, because in my neighborhood, it's it might be a sunny day, but it doesn't look sunny to me. It looks gloomy. So I like coming out to downtown, and I like just moving around. So like when I grow up, I know for a fact I want to open up my own eye clinic back in Sunnyside and get back to the community.
You want to come home?
Yeah, I want to come back home and give back to the community.
Yeah, one of the big issues in the criminal justice system, I'm not telling any folks anything you don't know, is the idea that kids who are in the system sometimes get put back in the system because, not necessarily because they broke a law, but because they broke a rule, something to do with their probation. If there was something you could fix in that system, what would it be?
The point of entry, right? As a former school teacher, I think I sent about one child to the principal's office because we worked out those issues in the classroom. We addressed them collectively, and I did not make a mockery of the escalation and referral process. The point of entry for many of our youth in the criminal justice system does not start in the community, it starts in our classrooms.
In schools, right.
Right? And much like police officers, teachers, and all professionals, the largest amount of strength comes from the amount of their discretion. You know, so if you got a teacher that is really putting a child and labeling a child, and whether through implicit bias or explicit bias, is railroading this child because they can't, because they don't believe, because I've always believed that I'm not what I think I am, I'm not what you think I am what I think you think I am. Then my behavior is influenced by the way I think you perceive me. I had a young man who walked in my classroom every day. He was the classroom bully at Fondren Middle School. He was drunk and he was high in the 7th grade. All the teachers wanted to refer him to my class because when he came in, there was a sense of hope. Remember, we can't live a second without hope. And I told him, I said, you're a bully, huh? I said, great leadership skills. Let us find another way to put them to use. And I put him in charge of my class. And every time he came to my class, I was a science teacher, so I did all the fun stuff. He did it. His breath smelled like spearmint and peppermint, and his eyes became wider. He eventually moved on and got promoted and graduated. It was just that one level of support. So if you're talking about the criminal justice system, I don't want to look at the back end, I look at the front end. Because as soon as you send that child to the principal's office, or as soon as that Houston ISD police officer engaged them with silver handcuffs that don't separate, then we've just created a pro-trauma stress situation. Give it that. Yeah, you can get that. That's good. Because let me tell you something. Let me level the playing field. The people who are in our justice system are just like us, but we just have not got caught yet. Because you cannot say what it feels like until you feel it on your own arms. And you put on that orange suit and it feels tough on the body of your skin. You may hear what I'm saying right now, but I need you to pay attention to the message. The point of entry is where we find the degradation of our systems. The discretion that police officers have are paramount to this process. And I can tell you one thing, everybody knows in this room, when you are on that car on any street and you see those disco lights in behind you, you ain't celebrating. There's a level of trepidation that goes through that body that's unlike any other movie or horror film that you see. Your body clench and the anxiety and your endorphins flow and you're like, what did I do wrong? You can be a judge, you can be a principal, or you can be Elvin Cleoto who drove in Prairie View at 1:30 in the morning and got cited for doing 76 because the 75 marker would have gave him a $100 ticket instead of a 76 that gave him a $300 ticket, who had to spend his scholarship money to recompense and pay tithe to Waller County. So what I'm saying, Allison, is that if we want to address the problem, we can go through the whole situation and begin to evaluate and dissect and bring together what we need to do post-entry. Because I look at the justice system in 4 lenses: prevention, intervention, enforcement, and reentry recovery. But if we put our energy on prevention and intervention, then the enforcement and recovery will be something different. In the state of Texas, on March the 29th, 2017, Senate Bill 30 was passed that will require every high school student seeking to graduate And every person in the state of Texas seeking a driver's license and every police officer governed under the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement to receive at least 1 hour of instruction on how to talk to one another. Now, you might say, what is that and how is that a big deal? Well, I can tell you what, we haven't got that right in our marriages, have we? Talking together.
Now, that's a huge deal.
That's a huge deal.
Communication is a huge deal.
Communication is the thread to everything happening.
I want to get some mics out here because I knew we were going to have some questions.
Okay, so let me wrap up real quick. So the idea is that if we inform and educate, level the playing field, then obviously we can have an opportunity we can live in harmony to some extent.
We've got time for one question, one or two. Anybody? Right over here? Yes.
I think I have more than just I have a statement.
Okay.
Sitting here, I'm with Wyndham School District out of Huntsville, and sitting here is kind of a out-of-body experience for me.
Wow.
Because at 18 years old, I'm 50 years old now, and I think I look pretty good for 50. But at
you know what a Polaroid is.
At 18 years old, I was that one when I was going to sit here and just be quiet and just listen. But when you said something about those orange jumpsuits and those handcuffs that don't separate and all that kind of stuff, I'm from Beaumont, but I moved to Houston when I was 18 years old in 1986. And just that kid, Sunnyside, just kind of hanging around and just kind of milling around, even though I had a scholarship to U of H, I was still that young black kid, just flowing, just rolling around, and got caught up on Hiram Clark and wind up going into Harris County and doing about 3 months, and then this is where it comes, this is my thing, my statement. Education should be about the transformation of self and society. So if we're going to work with our young black boys, our young brown people, I hate the word minority, I hate the word African American, I'm an American, I just happen to be black. So I was born here and that's the way it is, okay? So if we're going to change it where these young brothers and sisters are no longer becoming parts of this systematic white privilege that we see all the time and the systematic racism, then we've got to inform them from the womb. I have 2 boys who are clean and upright and strong, and I have a daughter who's now going to Sam Houston for music therapy. And the reason that they are the way that they are is because, number one, me and Mom have been married 30 years, and secondly, we began to educate them from the womb.
That's right.
So if we're going to change this thing, then we have to do what? Educate them. Educate them in the school, educate them in the home, educate them so that when they go out and meet a police officer,
that's right,
they will know their own rights instead of having to be all polite because they don't know what this Mr. Policeman or policewoman is going to do to them. So my only statement is education. Continue doing, I was going to be cool and just sit down.
That's all right.
Education.
Got a conversation.
Education. Education. Thank you.
You know, Barbara, thank you. You look like you're about 30. Thank you. Barbara Jordan said that education has always been the key to both economic and political empowerment. And you're so right. And with My Brother's Keeper, President Barack Obama in 2014 launched the My Brother's Keeper Challenge, and Houston is like one of 250 in all 50 states and DC and Puerto Rico that accepted the challenge. And Elvin was a product of the MBK internship. But he says this, that there are 6 pillars that can help combat community eruption. 1 is entering school ready to learn. 2 is reading on grade level by the 3rd grade. 3, graduating high school prepared for college and or career, because a diploma is not a celebratory moment anymore. All right? 4 is completing post-secondary education or training. 5 is successfully entering the workforce. And 6 is when you find a brother walking down Hiram Clark and got caught up, is to provide them a second chance opportunity so they can get back on track. And that's the continuum that we're working in with the city of Houston. So though there are problems, there are also solutions. And one of those things that we have to keep in mind is that we can't boil the ocean. If we did, we have a great fish fry, but we can't boil it. So we have to be methodical, systematic about our approach to address that. And education, health, employment, and the justice are the systems that make that happen.
Please join me in thanking Noel and wishing Elvin all the best next year.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you, Noel. Thank you, Elvin. Thank you, Allison. That was an inspired way to end the day, I would say. And thank you to all our speakers and moderators this morning. The importance of education and the importance of hope, I think, true in Houston and true everywhere. I think it's fair to say that this has been a deep and wide-ranging and important conversation and not an easy one. It's one that will continue in the pages of our magazine, online, and on stage. Thank you, Houston, for having us here. Thank you again to the MacArthur Foundation and the Safety and Justice Challenge for making this journalism possible. We're really grateful for your support. Most importantly, thank you to everybody who's here and who stayed with us throughout the morning. We know how precious your time is, so thank you for spending so much of it with us. One last request before you go. You will get an email from me with a quick survey asking about your experience here, what you saw, what you felt. We'd love you to fill it out because we actually do pay attention to everything you say, and it informs our journalism and it informs how we set up these forums. So have a wonderful rest of your day, Houston. Thank you so much.